Welcome. You are listening to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, shall we reveal a secret lost within the dusty pages of time? An epic journey of 50 chapters is about to begin, from silent libraries where candlelight flickers to relentless pursuits on stormy nights. This mysterious tale, flowing from the pen of scribe Thomas, will quiet your mind and prepare you for a deep, restful sleep. Turn out the lights, close your eyes, and focus only on my voice. Our story begins. The year was 1345. It was a very cold morning in autumn. A thick, white fog covered the ground like a heavy blanket. Thomas walked slowly along the narrow path toward the Abbey of St. Jude's. He was 30 years old and worked as a scribe. He had thin fingers with black ink stains on his skin. He loved his work. He loved the smell of old books and the quiet life of the library. Every morning, Thomas walked from his small house in the village to the big stone walls of the abbey. Usually, the world was full of small noises. He usually heard the birds in the trees or the wind in the grass. But today, the world was silent. The fog was so thick that he could not see the top of the abbey's great tower. Thomas reached the main entrance. He stopped. He felt a sudden chill that was not from the wind. The heavy wooden gates were wide open. This was very strange. Brother Peter, the gatekeeper, always locked the gates at sunset. He never opened them until the sun was high in the sky. Thomas walked closer. He looked at the ground. He saw the large iron lock. It was lying in the mud. He picked it up. The metal was cold and heavy. He noticed that the lock was broken into two pieces. It looked like someone used a heavy hammer to destroy it. Thomas felt his heart beat faster. He looked into the dark courtyard of the abbey. "Brother Peter!" Thomas called out. His voice was quiet in the heavy air. No one answered. He walked through the gates. The courtyard was empty. Usually, the monks were busy at this hour. They usually carried water or walked to the chapel for morning prayers. Today, there was no one. He walked toward the stone stables. The horses inside were moving restlessly. They made low, nervous noises. They were afraid of something. Thomas looked at the ground near the stable door. The mud was soft because of the rain from the night before. He saw marks in the mud. They were not the marks of sandals. The monks always wore simple leather sandals. These marks were from heavy, expensive boots. Thomas followed the footprints. They led away from the stables and toward the great chapel. The large oak doors of the chapel were also open. Thomas entered the building. It was very dark and very cold inside. The air smelled like old incense and beeswax candles. But the candles were not lit. He walked toward the altar. In the center of the altar, there was usually a beautiful golden box. It was the most important thing in the abbey. It held a sacred relic from a saint. People traveled for many miles to see it. Thomas reached the altar and gasped. The golden box was gone. The red silk cloth that sat under the box was now on the floor. It was torn. Thomas stood alone in the dark chapel. He knew that the peace of St. Jude's was over. Thomas stood in front of the stone altar. His hands were cold and his breath was visible in the chilly air. The golden box was truly gone. For 100 years, that box stayed in this exact spot. It was made of heavy gold and silver. It had small, bright blue stones on the lid. Now, there was only a flat, grey stone surface covered in dust. Thomas looked closer at the altar. He noticed a long scratch on the side of the stone. It was a new scratch. The thief was in a very big hurry. The person did not pick up the box carefully. They pulled it across the stone with force. Thomas bent down and looked at the red silk cloth on the floor. He picked it up slowly. The silk was very soft. But it was ruined. It had a long cut from a sharp knife. A heavy door at the back of the chapel moved. It made a long, sharp noise as it opened against the stone floor. Thomas turned around quickly. An old man entered the chapel. It was Brother John. He was 60 years old and had a very kind face. He was the monk who took care of the chapel and the small garden outside. Brother John stopped walking. He looked at Thomas. Then, he looked at the altar. His face became very pale. He dropped the wooden bucket he was carrying. The bucket hit the floor, and water spilled across the stones. "Thomas!" Brother John whispered. His voice was shaking. "Where is the sacred relic? Where is the golden box?" "It is gone, Brother John." Thomas replied. He tried to keep his own voice calm. "I found the main gates open. The lock is broken into pieces. I came here and found this." Brother John sat down on a wooden bench. He looked very weak. He put his head in his hands. "This is a disaster. This is a very dark day for St. Jude's. The abbot will be very angry. The villagers will be very afraid. That relic is the heart of our home." Thomas walked over to the monk. He put a hand on the old man's shoulder. "We must find it, Brother John. But first, we must tell the abbot." Brother John looked up. His eyes were full of fear. "The abbot is in the library. He is waiting for his morning tea. But he will not want tea after he hears this news." Thomas looked at the floor one more time. Near the spot where the bucket fell, he saw something small. It was a tiny piece of metal. It was not gold or silver. It was dark iron. It looked like a piece of a broken tool or a key. Thomas did not touch it yet. He wanted to show the scene to the abbot exactly as he found it. "Brother John," Thomas said quietly, "did you see anyone this morning? You are always in the garden early." Brother John looked nervous. He looked at the open chapel doors. I saw a shadow. It was near the back wall of the garden, near the tall trees. I thought it was a large animal or a deer. But now, I am not sure. It was a very tall shadow, and it moved very fast." Thomas thought about the tall shadow. He thought about the heavy boot marks in the mud outside. A monk in sandals could not make those marks. A deer could not break a heavy iron lock. He knew this was a crime by a strong and prepared person. "Stay here," Thomas said. "Do not touch anything. I will go to the library and bring the abbot." Thomas left the chapel and walked quickly across the stone courtyard. The fog was still thick. It made everything look grey and cold. He reached the library door. The library was the largest room in the abbey. It was full of tall wooden shelves. The shelves held hundreds of books. Most books were made of expensive parchment. Thomas spent many hours here every day. He loved the quiet work of writing and copying letters. He opened the heavy oak door. The library was warm because a small fire burned in the fireplace. The air smelled like dry paper and wood smoke. At the far end of the room, a man sat at a very large desk. This was Abbot Matthew. He was a tall man with white hair and a very serious face. He wore a long black robe with a silver cross around his neck. He was reading a large book by the light of a single candle. The abbot looked up when Thomas entered. He looked surprised. Thomas was usually very quiet, but today he looked worried. "Thomas," the abbot said, "you look pale. Why are you not at your desk? There is a lot of work to do today." Thomas stood in front of the desk. He felt his hands shaking. "Father, I have terrible news. I went to the chapel for morning prayers. The main gates are broken. The golden box is gone from the altar. The sacred relic is missing." The abbot did not move. He did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at the candle on his desk. Then, he stood up slowly. His face changed from surprise to deep sadness. He looked very old in the dim light. "Are you sure, Thomas?" The abbot asked quietly. I am sure. Thomas replied. Brother John is at the chapel now. He is very upset. I saw footprints in the mud. They were from heavy boots, not sandals, and the lock on the gate was destroyed with a hammer. The abbot walked to the window. He looked out at the fog. This is a very dangerous situation. That relic is a gift from the king's family. If it is lost, the abbey will be in great trouble. The lord of the village, Sir Richard, will be very angry. We must find it before the news spreads to the neighboring towns. The abbot turned back to Thomas. He looked into Thomas's eyes. Thomas, you are a clever man. You see things that other men do not see. You notice the small details in the books you copy. You are also not a monk, so you can move through the village and talk to the people more easily than we can. Thomas nodded. He understood what the abbot wanted. I want you to find the thief. The abbot said, I want you to find the golden box. I am summoning you to be the official investigator for the abbey. Talk to the guards. Talk to the people in the village. Do not let anyone leave the grounds until you speak to them. Thomas felt a heavy responsibility. He was just a scribe, not a soldier or a guard. But he knew the abbey was his home. He wanted to protect it. I will do my best, Father. Thomas said, Go back to the chapel. The abbot ordered, Look at everything again. I will send a messenger to Sir Richard. We need his help, but we must be careful. We do not know who to trust. Thomas bowed and left the room. He felt the weight of the abbot's words. The quiet life of a scribe was gone. Now, he was a seeker of truth in a world of shadows. Thomas walked out of the library and went straight to the back of the chapel. The fog was finally starting to lift. He could see the shapes of the trees in the distance. The abbey garden was a peaceful place. Usually, it was full of the smell of rosemary, lavender, and mint. Today, it felt cold and lonely. He found Brother John near the stone wall at the edge of the garden. The old monk was standing very still. He was looking at a patch of crushed flowers. Thomas walked over to him. The grass was wet with dew, and his boots made dark marks on the green lawn. Brother John, Thomas said softly, the abbot wants me to find the thief. I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Brother John turned around. His face was still very pale. He pointed to a tall, grey stone wall. It was very early, Thomas. The sun was not up yet. I came here to pick some herbs for the kitchen. I saw something move near that wall. What did it look like? Thomas asked. He looked at the wall. It was very high. It was a shadow. Brother John said. It was much taller than a normal man. It moved very quickly, like a ghost. It wore a long, dark cloak. The cloak was heavy and reached the ground. I did not see a face. The person had a hood over their head. Thomas walked closer to the wall. He saw a row of lavender plants. Many of the purple flowers were broken and pushed into the dirt. Someone heavy stepped here. Thomas knelt down to look at the ground. He saw the same boot marks he found near the stables. They were large and deep. Did the shadow carry anything? Thomas asked. Brother John nodded. Yes. The person held a large object under their arm. It was wrapped in a dark cloth, but I saw a small flash of yellow. It must be the golden box. Thomas looked at the top of the wall. There were some loose stones at the top. He noticed a small piece of dark thread caught on a sharp rock. He stood up and reached for it. It was a thick, wool horizontal thread. It was not the kind of cheap wool the monks wore. This was expensive material. The thief climbed the wall. Thomas remarked. A thief with a heavy golden box climbed a 2-meter wall in the dark. This person is very strong. Brother John looked worried. Or maybe there were two people. One to carry the box and one to help them over the wall. Thomas thought about this. It was a good point. He looked at the ground again. He followed the footprints. They led from the chapel door, across the garden, and directly to this spot at the wall. There were no footprints leading back. This meant the thief did not go out through the broken front gates. They used the gates to enter, but they jumped over the wall to leave. "Thank you, Brother John," Thomas said. "Go inside and stay with the others. Do not talk about the shadow to the villagers yet. We do not want to start a panic." Thomas stayed in the garden alone. He looked at the high wall and the broken flowers. He felt like someone was watching him from the trees outside the abbey. He shivered and put the piece of dark thread into his pocket. Thomas walked back to the library. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the fog was almost gone. The abbey felt very cold and very quiet. He found Abbot Matthew sitting at his large wooden desk. The abbot was not reading his books now. He was staring at the small fire in the fireplace. His hands were joined together, and he looked very worried. "Father," Thomas said as he entered the room, "I found something in the garden." The abbot looked up quickly. "What did you find, Thomas? Did you find the thief?" Thomas shook his head. "No, Father, but I found a piece of dark wool on the garden wall. It is very expensive cloth." And Brother John saw a tall shadow in a dark cloak. The thief climbed over the high wall with the golden box. The abbot sighed and leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas. "Come closer, Thomas. I must tell you why this is a very big problem. It is not just about a missing box." Thomas sat on a small wooden stool near the desk. He waited for the abbot to speak. "In 3 days." The abbot began quietly. "The king's cousin is coming to visit St. Jude's. His name is Lord Henry. He is a very powerful man. He is coming here to see the sacred relic. The king gave that relic to this abbey many years ago. It is a sign of the king's friendship and his protection." Thomas felt a cold shiver. And if the relic is not here when Lord Henry arrives, then the king will be very angry. The abbot replied, "He will think we are careless. He might take away our land. He might stop giving us money for our food and our medicine. Without the king's protection, the abbey will close. The monks will have no home, and the village will have no help." Thomas looked at the piece of dark thread in his hand. The situation was much worse than he thought. This was not a simple theft. This was a threat to everyone in the valley. Why would someone steal it now? Thomas asked, "Does someone want to hurt the abbey?" "Perhaps," the abbot said. "Or perhaps they want to sell the gold and the jewels. But the timing is very strange. Someone knew the king's cousin was coming. Someone knew this was the worst time for the relic to disappear." The abbot stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the village of Blackwood in the distance. "Thomas, you must find that box before Lord Henry arrives. You have 3 days. I will give you a letter. It says that you are working for me. You can ask anyone any question. Do not be afraid to look in every house and every shop." Thomas stood up too. He felt the weight of the task. "I will start now, Father. I will go to the gatekeeper first. He must know how the thief entered the grounds." "Be careful, Thomas," the abbot warned. "The person who stole the relic is strong and clever. They might be watching you right now." Thomas nodded. He put the dark thread in his pocket and left the library. The sun was bright now, but the shadows in the corners of the abbey felt very dark. Thomas turned to leave the library. He reached for the heavy iron handle of the door, but then he stopped. He looked down at the floor near the entrance. The library floor was made of beautiful, light-colored stone. The monks swept the floor every single day. It was usually very clean and shiny. Today, there was a dark mark on the stone. Thomas knelt down to look at it. It was a small piece of dried mud. It was the size of a coin. He looked further into the room. He saw another small mark, and then another one. There was a trail of small mud spots leading from the door toward the back of the library. "Father," Thomas said. His voice was a whisper. "Did you have any visitors in the library last night?" Abbot Matthew walked over to Thomas. He looked at the floor. "No, Thomas. I was here alone until late in the evening. Then I went to my room to sleep. I did not see anyone." Thomas followed the trail of mud. It did not lead to the abbot's desk. Instead, it led to a tall wooden shelf at the very back of the room. This shelf held the old records of the abbey. There were books about the history of the building and maps of the land. Thomas looked at the books on the shelf. One book was not in its correct place. It was a large, heavy book with a brown leather cover. The title of the book was The Foundations of St. Jude's. Thomas pulled the book from the shelf. He felt the cover. It was slightly damp. "Someone was here," Thomas said. "Someone came into the library while you were sleeping, Father. They were looking for this book." The abbot looked shocked. "But the library door is always locked at night. I have the only key." Thomas looked at the book in his hands. He opened it slowly. The pages were old and yellow. He turned the pages until he found a large map of the abbey buildings. He saw a small, dirty fingerprint on the corner of the map. The fingerprint was right over the drawing of the great chapel. They were not just looking for the box, Thomas said. They were looking for a way into the chapel. Or perhaps a way out. He looked closely at the mud on the floor. It was a different color than the mud in the courtyard. The mud in the courtyard was gray and sandy. This mud was dark red. Thomas knew that red mud. It was only found in one place, near the river at the bottom of the hill. The thief came from the river, Thomas said. They entered the library first. They studied the maps of the abbey. Then, they went to the chapel to steal the relic. The abbot rubbed his face with his hands. He looked very tired. This means the thief is very patient. They planned this for a long time. They knew about the maps. They knew where to find them. Thomas felt a cold feeling in his stomach. The thief was not a simple criminal. The thief was someone who knew the abbey very well. "I will go to the river," Thomas said. "I want to see if there are more tracks. If the thief came from the water, they might have left something behind." Thomas put the book back on the shelf. He felt the piece of dark wool in his pocket. The mystery was growing. He had a piece of expensive cloth, a tall shadow, and now, red mud from the river. The sun was high now. Thomas walked across the courtyard toward the main gates. Suddenly, a loud noise came from the road outside. It was the sound of many heavy horses. The horses were moving fast. Their metal shoes hit the dry earth with a hard, fast rhythm. A group of men rode through the broken gates. In the front was a man on a large white horse. He wore a bright red cloak and a silver helmet that shone in the sun. This was Sir Richard. He was the lord of the lands around the village. He was a tall man with a big black beard and very dark eyes. He looked very angry. The abbot came out of the chapel to meet him. Thomas stood quietly to the side. "Abbot Matthew!" Sir Richard shouted. His voice was like a storm. He did not get off his horse. He looked down at the monks from his high saddle. "What is this news?" "My messenger says the sacred relic is gone." "How did this happen?" The abbot bowed his head respectfully. "It is true, Sir Richard. Someone broke the lock last night. The golden box is missing from the altar." Sir Richard looked at the broken gates. Then he looked at the monks who were standing near the walls. The monks looked very afraid. They kept their heads down and did not speak. "This is a disgrace," Sir Richard said. He hit the side of his horse with his gloved hand. "The king is my friend. If he hears that I cannot protect his gift, he will be very disappointed. I have 50 soldiers at my castle. Why did you not ask for more guards?" "We thought the abbey was a place of peace." The abbot replied softly, "We did not think anyone would be so bold. But we are looking for the thief. This man, Thomas the scribe, is leading the investigation." Sir Richard turned his horse toward Thomas. He looked down at the scribe. His eyes were cold and suspicious. "A scribe?" Sir Richard laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a cold, dry sound. "He is a man of books. He has small hands. He does not know how to catch a criminal. A criminal needs a sword, not a piece of parchment." Thomas looked up at the knight. He felt small, but he did not show his fear. "A sword is good for a battle, Sir Richard, but a criminal leaves small signs. A scribe is trained to see those signs. I have already found clues." Sir Richard stopped laughing. He leaned down toward Thomas. The smell of leather and horse sweat was very strong. "What clues? Tell me now." Thomas thought about the red mud and the dark thread. He decided to keep some secrets. He did not know if he could trust the knight. "I found footprints, Sir Richard. They belong to a man with heavy boots. A man who is very strong and can climb high walls." Sir Richard looked at his own boots. They were made of expensive leather and were very heavy. "Many men have heavy boots. My soldiers have heavy boots. The blacksmith has heavy boots. This is not enough. I am going to the river now," Thomas said. "I believe the thief went that way." Sir Richard pulled the reins of his horse. The animal moved its head and breathed loudly. "Go then, scribe. But remember this. If you do not find the gold by the time the king's cousin arrives, I will take control of this abbey myself. I will put my soldiers in every room." The knight and his men turned their horses and rode away. They left a big cloud of dust in the air. Thomas watched them go. He felt more pressure than before. He did not just have to find the thief. He had to save the abbey from Sir Richard too. Thomas did not go to the river immediately. He remembered his plan to speak with the gatekeeper. He walked back toward the main entrance of the abbey. Near the broken gates, there was a small stone house. This was where Brother Peter lived. Brother Peter was a short man with a very round face. Usually, he was a very happy person. He loved to tell jokes and share bread with the travelers. But today, he was sitting on a wooden bench outside his door. He looked very tired. His eyes were red, and his hands were shaking. "Brother Peter," Thomas said gently, "are you all right?" The gatekeeper looked up. He did not smile. "I am not well, Thomas. I am very confused. I do not know how this happened." Thomas sat down on the bench next to him. "Tell me about last night. Did you hear the thief? Did you see the person who broke the lock?" Brother Peter shook his head. "That is the problem, Thomas. I did not hear anything. I am the gatekeeper. My job is to listen for every noise. But last night, I fell into a very deep sleep. It was not a normal sleep. It felt like a heavy fog was inside my head." Thomas looked at the small table near the bench. There was a wooden cup on the table. A little bit of wine was still at the bottom. Thomas picked up the cup and smelled it. The wine had a strange, sweet smell. It was not the smell of the abbey's normal wine. "Where did you get this wine, Peter?" Thomas asked. "A traveler gave it to me yesterday evening," Peter replied. He was a tall man in a dark cloak. He said he was a pilgrim from the north. He was very kind. He gave me the wine because the night was cold. I drank 1 cup, and then I do not remember anything until this morning. Thomas put the cup down. He knew now why Peter did not hear the hammer hit the lock. The traveler drugged the wine to make the gatekeeper sleep. Peter, Thomas said, look at your belt. Do you have your keys? Brother Peter looked at his leather belt. His face went from pale to white. He touched his waist with both hands. No. They are gone. My iron ring with all the keys is gone. Thomas felt a cold energy in his chest. Which keys were on that ring? The key to the main gates. Peter said quickly. The key to the stables. And the key to the library. Now Thomas understood. The thief did not need to break into the library. They had the key. They walked into the library quietly while the abbot slept. They looked at the maps. Then, they went to the chapel. They probably tried to use the key on the gate. But the lock was old and difficult. Maybe the thief became angry or was in a hurry. So they used a hammer instead. The man in the dark cloak. Thomas said, what did he look like? Did you see his face? No. Peter sighed. The hood of his cloak was very low. I only saw his beard. It was a short, brown beard. And he had a ring on his finger. It was a silver ring with a red stone. Thomas stood up. This was a very important clue. He had a piece of dark wool, a description of a beard, and a silver ring. Stay here, Peter. Thomas said, do not worry. It was not your fault. The thief was very clever. Thomas left the gatekeeper and looked toward the river at the bottom of the hill. He needed to find the man with the silver ring. Thomas walked back to the tall stone wall in the garden. He wanted to see exactly how the thief climbed over. The wall was very high, and the stones were mostly smooth. It was a very difficult wall to climb, especially while carrying a heavy golden box. Thomas looked at the ground again. He saw where the thief's boots pressed into the soft earth. Then he looked up at the wall. About halfway up the wall, there was a small hole between 2 stones. Thomas put his fingers in the hole. He realized it was a perfect place for a foot. Higher up, there was another small hole. Someone had removed the mortar between the stones to make a secret ladder. This was not a lucky escape. This was a planned path. Thomas looked at the stone next to the second hole. He saw something strange. There was a small symbol carved into the grey rock. It was a circle with a vertical line through the center. The edges of the carving were very white and sharp. This meant the mark was new. It was made recently, perhaps only a few days ago. Thomas touched the mark with his thumb. The stone felt dusty under his fingers. As a scribe, he knew many symbols. He knew the marks of the stonemasons who built the abbey. He knew the symbols used by the local merchants. But he did not recognize this one. It looked like a secret sign. A circle and a line. Thomas said to himself, "What does it mean?" He looked around the garden again. He saw another stone near the library window. He walked over to it and looked closely at the corner of the window frame. There was the same symbol. It was very small. A person would not see it if they were not looking for it. Thomas felt a shiver. The thief did not just walk into the abbey by chance. The thief, or someone helping the thief, marked the way. They marked the library because it had the maps. They marked the wall because it was the best way to leave. This was a very professional crime. He thought about the traveler with the silver ring. A simple traveler would not know where the maps were kept. A simple thief would not carve symbols into the stone. This was part of a larger plan. Thomas took a small piece of parchment and a charcoal stick from his pocket. He carefully copied the symbol onto the paper. He needed to show this to someone in the village. Perhaps the blacksmith or the innkeeper knew who used this mark. The sun was moving across the sky. Thomas knew he was running out of time. The king's cousin was coming soon. He turned away from the wall and started the long walk down the hill toward the village of Blackwood and the river. He wanted to find that red mud. Thomas left the abbey behind him. The path down the hill was narrow and rocky. The air in the valley was warmer than the air at the top of the hill. He could see the village of Blackwood below. It was a small place with 20 houses and a large mill. A wide river moved slowly past the village. He reached the bank of the river. He stopped and looked at the ground. Here, the earth was different. It was dark and very red. He stepped into the soft mud. It stuck to the bottom of his boots. It was exactly like the mud he found in the library. This was the place. The thief definitely stood here. Thomas looked at the water. The river was deep. Someone could easily arrive by boat, hide in the trees, and then walk up the hill to the abbey. Thomas followed the river toward the village. He saw a few men working near the water. They were pulling heavy nets from the river. They were strong men with thick arms. None of them wore a dark cloak. They wore simple tunics made of rough cloth. They looked at Thomas as he passed, but they did not say anything. He entered the main street of Blackwood. The street was busy. A man was leading a large cart full of yellow hay. A woman was selling fresh bread from a big basket. Thomas looked at everyone's hands. He was looking for a silver ring with a red stone. He saw many hands, but no rings. Most people here were farmers or workers. They did not have expensive jewelry. Thomas walked to the center of the village. There was a large building with a wooden sign of an old tree. This was the Broken Oak Inn. It was the only place where travelers stayed. If a man in a dark cloak came to the village, he probably went to the inn. Thomas pushed the heavy wooden door and went inside. The room was dim and smelled of roasted meat and old ale. A few men sat at a long table. They were talking quietly about the weather and the harvest. A large man stood behind the wooden counter. He was cleaning a cup with a white cloth. This was Robert, the innkeeper. He was a tall man with a friendly face. "Good day, Thomas," Robert said. "You look like you have walked a long way. Do you want some ale or a bowl of soup?" "No, thank you, Robert," Thomas replied. He walked to the counter. "I am here on business for the abbot. I am looking for a traveler. He is a tall man. He wears a dark cloak and has a brown beard. He also has a silver ring with a red stone." Robert stopped cleaning the cup. He looked at the other men in the room. Then he looked back at Thomas. "A man like that was here last night. He arrived when the sun was going down. He was very quiet. He did not want to talk to anyone. He stayed in a corner and kept his hood over his head." Thomas felt a spark of hope. "Is he still here?" Robert shook his head. "No. He left very early this morning, before the fog was gone. He paid with a silver coin and rode away on a black horse. He was in a great hurry." Thomas took the piece of parchment from his pocket. He showed the symbol of the circle and the line to the innkeeper. "Have you ever seen this mark before?" Robert looked at the drawing for a long time. He frowned. "I have seen it once, but not on a piece of paper. I saw it on a wooden box in the back of a merchant's cart. The merchant said he was from the city of Oak Haven." Thomas folded the paper. Now he had a direction. The thief was moving toward the city, and the symbol belonged to a merchant. Thomas left the Broken Oak Inn and walked toward the edge of the village. The air here was hot and smelled of burning coal. He heard the steady rhythm of a heavy hammer hitting metal. The sound was very loud and echoed against the stone houses. Thomas reached a large open building. This was the blacksmith's shop. Inside, A very large man was working near a bright orange fire. He had big muscles and his face was covered in black soot. This was Master William. He was the strongest man in Blackwood. He held a piece of glowing red iron with long metal tongs. He hit the iron with a massive hammer to shape it. Thomas waited for a moment. He did not want to interrupt the work. When the iron became dark again, Master William put it into a barrel of water. A big cloud of white steam rose into the air. The blacksmith wiped his forehead with his arm and looked at Thomas. "Good day, Thomas," William said. His voice was deep. "Do you have a broken tool from the library? Or does the abbot need a new candle holder?" Thomas took the broken lock from his bag. He placed the 2 pieces of heavy iron on the blacksmith's wooden table. "I need you to look at this, William. It is the lock from the abbey's main gate." William picked up the pieces. He looked at the broken edges very carefully. He frowned and moved closer to the light of the fire. "This is a very strong lock, Thomas. I made this lock myself 5 years ago. It is good iron." "How was it broken?" Thomas asked. William pointed to a flat mark on the metal. "It was not broken by a small tool. Someone used a very large, heavy hammer, but they did not hit it many times. Look here. The metal is cut cleanly. They used a special chisel made of hardened steel. Only a professional builder or a master smith has a tool like that." Thomas felt his heart sink. This meant the thief was not just a lucky traveler. They had professional tools. Could a normal man do this? A normal man? No. William replied. He must be very strong. And he must know exactly where to hit the lock to make it snap. It was a very fast job. Thomas then showed the blacksmith the drawing of the symbol, the circle with the line. "Have you seen this mark on any tools or metal?" William looked at the drawing. He rubbed his chin with his dirty hand. "I do not see that mark on tools. But I saw it on the horseshoes of a black horse this morning. A man stopped here at sunrise. His horse lost a shoe. The new shoe was fine, but the old shoe had that same symbol carved into the iron. I thought it was a mark of a special stable in the city." Thomas felt a jolt of excitement. The thief's horse was marked too. "Which way did he go, William?" "He went toward the north road," William said, pointing away from the village. "He said he was going to Oak Haven. He was a tall man. He did not show his face." Thomas thanked the blacksmith and left the shop. He knew he had to follow the north road. But first, he had to return to the abbey to tell the abbot what he discovered. Thomas walked back up the long hill toward the abbey. The sun was now very hot on his back. He felt tired, but his mind was busy with many thoughts. He thought about the red mud, the silver ring, and the blacksmith's words. The thief was strong, professional, and moving toward the city of Oak Haven. He reached the abbey gates. The monks were now busy cleaning the courtyard. They moved quietly. Some used brooms to sweep away the mud. Others were trying to fix the heavy wooden doors. Thomas walked past them and entered the cool, dark library. He went to his small wooden desk in the corner. This was his favorite place. It had his pens, his ink, and his clean parchment. But today, something was different. In the center of his desk, there was a small piece of paper. It was folded neatly. Thomas felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He did not leave any paper on his desk this morning. He picked it up slowly. The paper was very white and smooth. It was high-quality parchment, much better than the paper used in the village. There was no name on the outside. He unfolded the letter. The writing was very neat and elegant. The ink was dark and fresh. He read the words carefully. "Scribe, you are asking too many questions in the village. A wise man stays with his books. A foolish man follows a shadow into the dark. If you want to keep your hands healthy for writing, stop your search now. The relic is gone. It will not return to St. Jude's. Thomas stared at the paper. His hands began to shake slightly. This was a clear threat. Someone was watching him. Someone knew he went to the inn and the blacksmith shop. He looked around the library. The room was empty. Only the tall shelves of books watched him. The large windows let in the bright afternoon light, but the corners of the room felt full of secrets. He wondered how the person entered the library again. The abbot said he had the only key, but the thief had stolen the gatekeeper's keys earlier. Thomas stood up and walked to the abbot's desk. Abbot Matthew was not there, but his chair was pushed back. Thomas decided to wait. He sat down and looked at the letter again. He noticed something small at the bottom of the page. It was a faint smell. He lifted the paper to his nose. It smelled like expensive perfume and dried roses. It did not smell like a dirty thief or a traveler from the road. It smelled like someone from a rich house or a castle. Suddenly, the door opened. Thomas jumped. It was the abbot. He looked even more worried than before. "Thomas," the abbot said, "I have just heard that Sir Richard is sending 10 guards to live in the abbey. He says he wants to protect us, but I think he wants to control us. Did you find anything in the village?" Thomas showed the abbot the letter. "I found this on my desk, Father. Someone is trying to scare me. And they were here, in this room, only a few minutes ago." The abbot read the letter. His face became very hard. This is not the work of a simple thief. This is a message from someone powerful. Thomas left the library with a heavy heart. The letter in his pocket felt like a cold stone. The sun was now low in the sky, and the light was turning orange. Long, thin shadows stretched across the stone floors of the abbey. Thomas decided to walk through the cloisters. These were the covered walkways around the central garden. Usually, the cloisters were a place for quiet prayer and thought. As he walked, Thomas felt a strange sensation. The back of his neck felt cold. He felt like a pair of eyes was watching his every move. He stopped near a large stone pillar. He stayed very still and listened. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the trees. Then, he heard a very quiet noise. It was the soft sound of a heavy cloak brushing against a stone wall. Thomas turned around quickly. The long hallway was empty. The grey arches stood in a long line, but no one was there. He began to walk again, but this time he walked faster. His own footsteps were loud on the stone. Behind him, he heard another set of footsteps. They were light and fast. When Thomas stopped, the other footsteps stopped too. "Who is there?" Thomas called out. His voice was steady, but his heart was racing. No one answered. He moved toward the corner of the walkway. He peeked around the edge of a large statue. He saw a tall figure standing near the entrance to the cellar. The figure wore a long, dark cloak with a deep hood. It was the same person Brother John saw in the garden. The figure did not move. It stood perfectly still in the shadows. Thomas felt a wave of fear, but he also felt a spark of anger. This person was threatening him and stealing from his home. Thomas took a step toward the shadow. "I know you are there." Thomas shouted. "I have the letter. Why are you following me?" The tall figure suddenly moved. It did not run. It moved with a strange, smooth grace. It turned a corner and disappeared into the darkness of the lower halls. Thomas ran after it. He reached the corner and looked down the stairs. The stairs led to the deep cellars where the monks kept the wine and the winter food. The air coming from the stairs was very cold and smelled of damp earth. Thomas hesitated. He did not have a candle, and the cellar was a maze of dark rooms. He heard a heavy wooden door close far below. The sound was deep and final. He knew he could not follow the stranger into the dark without a light. He stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. He realized the thief was very comfortable inside the abbey. They knew the secret corners and the quiet hallways. The abbey was no longer a place of safety. Even with the sun shining outside, the inside of the walls felt like a trap. Thomas walked back to the main courtyard. He saw the first of Sir Richard's guards arriving. They wore metal armor and carried long spears. Their presence made the abbey feel like a fort, not a church. Thomas realized he had to be very careful. He had two enemies now, the thief in the shadows and the guards who wanted to take control. Thomas needed to find a place of peace. His heart was still beating very fast after the chase in the cloisters. He walked toward the infirmary. This was a small, quiet building where the monks took care of sick people. It always smelled of dried flowers and sweet honey. Inside, the room was warm. There were many jars on the wooden shelves. Each jar held a different herb or medicine. Sister Elena was working at a table. She was an older woman with very bright eyes and steady hands. She was not a monk, but she lived near the abbey and helped the brothers with her knowledge of healing. "Thomas," she said. She did not look up from her work. "You are breathing very fast. Sit down. I will make you some tea with mint and valerian." Thomas sat on a wooden chair. "Thank you, sister. It has been a very long day." Sister Elena brought him a warm cup. She sat across from him and looked at his face. "I heard about the golden box. Everyone is talking about it. The village is full of rumors. Some people say a demon took it. Others say it was a ghost." "It was no ghost," Thomas said. He took a sip of the tea. It felt warm and good in his stomach. "It was a man in a dark cloak. He is very strong and very clever. He even left a letter on my desk to tell me to stop." Sister Elena's face became very serious. She leaned forward. "Thomas, you must be very careful. I saw something last night too. I did not tell the abbot because he was already so upset." Thomas put his cup down. "What did you see, sister?" "I was in the garden late last night to pick some white lilies," she began. "I saw a tall man near the cellar door. He was not alone. He was talking to someone in the shadows. I could not see the second person, but I heard their voice. It was a woman's voice. She sounded like she was from a high family. She spoke with a very clear and sharp accent." Thomas was shocked. "A woman? Here in the abbey at night?" "Yes," Elena whispered. "And there is more. This morning, I went to my storage shelf. One of my jars was empty. It was the jar of sleep dust. It is a very strong medicine made from special purple flowers. If you put it in wine, a person will sleep for 10 hours and remember nothing." Thomas thought about Brother Peter, the gatekeeper. That explains why the gatekeeper did not hear the thief. The woman must have given him the wine. "The man is the muscle, Thomas," Sister Elena warned. "But the woman is the mind. She knows this abbey. She knows my medicines. And she knows where the keys are kept. Do not look for a simple thief in the woods. Look for someone who belongs in a palace or a castle." Thomas felt a new kind of fear. A strong thief was dangerous, but a clever woman with power was even more dangerous. He thanked Sister Elena for the tea and the warning. As he left the infirmary, he looked at the high walls of Sir Richard's castle on the hill. He wondered if the shadow came from there. The sun disappeared behind the hills. A messenger from the castle arrived at the abbey gates. He wore the yellow and black colors of Sir Richard. The messenger told Thomas that the Lord wanted to see him for dinner. Thomas did not want to go, but he could not say no to the most powerful man in the area. Thomas walked up the steep path to the castle. The stone walls were very high and thick. Torches burned in iron holders along the walls. The orange fire moved in the wind. The castle felt like a cold, sleeping giant. At the main gate, 2 soldiers checked Thomas for weapons. They found only his pens and a small bottle of ink. They laughed and let him enter. He was led into the great hall. It was a massive room with a very high ceiling. A large fire burned in a fireplace that was big enough for a horse to stand inside. Sir Richard sat at the head of a long wooden table. He was eating a large piece of roasted meat. He did not look up when Thomas entered. "Sit down, scribe," Sir Richard said. He pointed to a chair with his knife. "Eat. You look like you need it. You are too thin." Thomas sat down. A servant placed a silver plate in front of him. There was bread, meat, and a cup of dark wine. Thomas thought about the drugged wine at the gatehouse. He did not touch his cup. "Tell me," Sir Richard said. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Have you found my gold?" "My soldiers are searching the woods, but they found nothing." "I am following several clues, my lord." Thomas replied carefully. "I found a piece of expensive wool in the garden. I also saw a strange symbol on the wall. It is a circle with a line through it." Sir Richard stopped eating. He looked at Thomas with sharp eyes. "A circle and a line. That is a common mark. It means nothing. You are wasting time with drawings and threads." At that moment, a door at the far end of the hall opened. A woman walked into the room. She was very beautiful and wore a long dress made of deep blue silk. She had dark hair and a very proud face. Thomas remembered Sister Elena's words about a woman with a sharp accent. "This is my sister, Lady Isabella," Sir Richard said. The woman looked at Thomas. Her eyes were cold, like ice. She did not smile. "So, this is the man who is looking for the abbot's toy," she said. Her voice was exactly as Sister Elena described, clear and sharp. Thomas looked at her hands. She was wearing many rings, but he did not see a silver ring with a red stone. However, he noticed something else. On the back of her chair, there was a heavy cloak. It was made of dark, expensive wool. "The relic is very important for the peace of the valley, my lady," Thomas said. "Peace is for the weak," Isabella replied. She sat down next to her brother. "Power is what matters." Thomas felt very uncomfortable. He finished his bread quickly. He felt that the brother and sister were hiding something. They were not sad about the missing relic. They were impatient. Thomas realized that the danger did not just come from a thief in the night. It came from the people who lived in this very hall. Thomas left the castle. The stone walls were high and dark against the night sky. He walked down the hill toward the abbey. He felt very nervous. Lady Isabella was a strange woman. She was very cold and her eyes were full of secrets. He did not trust her, and he did not trust Sir Richard. He reached the abbey gates. The soldiers were there. They looked tired and did not look at him as he passed. Thomas did not go to his bed. He felt too restless to sleep. He walked around the stone buildings of the abbey. He looked at the great tower. Then he looked at the guest wing. This was a long building where visitors usually stayed. Usually, it was empty and quiet. But tonight, Thomas saw something strange. One window on the ground floor was different. The glass was gone. He walked closer. He saw small, shiny pieces on the grass. It was glass. Someone broke the window from the outside. Thomas looked at the stone wall. He saw deep scratches in the soft rock. Someone used a heavy tool here. Why is this window broken? Thomas asked himself quietly. The door to the building was locked with a heavy iron bolt. Thomas did not have a key, but the broken window was low. He was a thin man, and he knew he could climb inside. He put his hands on the stone ledge. He pulled himself up with his arms. He moved very slowly. He did not want to cut his skin on the sharp pieces of glass. He jumped into the room. It was very dark and very cold. The air smelled like dust and old wood. Thomas took a small candle and a flint from his pocket. He struck the flint. A small spark jumped, and the candle began to burn. The light was weak, but he could see the room. The room was a mess. A wooden chair was lying on its side. A small table was pushed against the wall. This was the room where the traveler stayed. This was the room of the man with the brown beard and the silver ring. Thomas looked at the floor. He saw a piece of paper under the wooden bed. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a map. But it was not a map of the abbey or the village. It was a map of the deep forest. There was a large red mark near the old river bridge. Then, he saw something else in the corner of the room. There was a heavy iron hammer. It was the same tool the blacksmith described. It was large, strong, and made of professional steel. The thief left it behind. Suddenly, Thomas heard a noise. It was the sound of a metal key turning in the door lock. Someone was coming into the room. Thomas quickly blew out his candle. He hid behind a large wooden wardrobe in the corner. His heart was beating very fast against his ribs. He stayed very still in the dark. The door opened. A man entered the room. He carried a bright torch. The orange light moved across the walls and the floor. Thomas watched through a small hole in the wood of the wardrobe. The man was tall. He wore the metal armor and the yellow cloak of Sir Richard's guards. The guard looked at the floor. He saw the empty space where the hammer was. He looked very angry. He walked to the broken window and looked out into the night. "He is not here," the guard said to himself. Thomas waited. He did not move a muscle. He realized a terrible truth. The thief had friends inside the castle. The guards were not at the abbey to help. They were here to hide the evidence. Thomas stayed behind the wooden wardrobe for a long time. He did not move. He did not even want to breathe loudly. The guard stood by the broken window for a few minutes. The orange light from his torch made long, dancing shadows on the walls. Finally, the guard turned and walked out of the room. He closed the door with a loud, heavy noise. Thomas heard the key turn in the lock again. He was trapped inside the room, but he was safe for now. He waited until he could no longer hear the guard's heavy boots in the hallway. Then, he came out from his hiding place. He took a deep breath. His heart was finally slowing down. Thomas went back to the wooden bed. He picked up the piece of paper he found earlier. He moved to the window so the moonlight could help him see. It was a map, but it was very detailed. It showed the abbey, the river, and the deep forest. But there were also strange dotted lines on the paper. These lines started under the great chapel and went deep into the woods. Tunnels. Thomas whispered. He remembered the book he found in the library, The Foundations of St. Jude's. The book mentioned old paths under the ground. The monks used them hundreds of years ago to store ice and extra food. Most people forgot they existed, but the thief knew about them. Thomas looked at the floor of the guest room. He remembered that the thief was a strong man. Why would a strong man stay in this small room and break a window? Perhaps the window was a trick. Perhaps the thief wanted people to look outside, while he was actually inside the floor. Thomas moved the small table. He pushed the heavy wooden bed to the side. He knelt on the cold stone floor and began to touch the edges of the stones. Most of them were solid and did not move. But near the corner, one stone felt different. It was slightly higher than the others. He used his thin fingers to pull at the edge of the stone. It moved. Thomas used all his strength to lift the heavy rock. Under the stone, there was a dark hole. A set of very old, narrow stairs went down into the earth. The air coming from the hole was very cold and smelled like wet stone and old metal. Thomas looked at the map again. One of the dotted lines started exactly in this part of the guest wing. This tunnel led directly to the old bridge by the river. This was how the thief entered the abbey without using the main gates. This was how the thief moved around at night without the monks seeing him. Thomas knew it was dangerous, but he had to know the truth. He could not wait for the morning. He put the map in his pocket. He took his small candle and his flint. He lit the candle again. The small flame danced in the cold wind from the hole. "I must follow the path," Thomas said to himself. He climbed into the hole and began to walk down the narrow stairs. The ceiling was very low. He had to bend his head. The walls were wet, and small drops of water fell from the ceiling. He was now deep under the abbey. He was alone in the dark, following the path of a thief. The tunnel was very long and very narrow. Thomas held his small candle with a steady hand. The flame was weak. It moved back and forth in the cold air. The walls of the tunnel were made of rough, grey stone. They were wet to the touch. In some places, thick spider webs hung from the ceiling. They felt like soft, sticky threads against his face. Thomas did not like the dark, but he knew he had to keep going. He walked for a long time. His boots made a soft, rhythmic sound on the damp floor. The air was heavy and smelled of old earth and salt. Every few steps, a large drop of water hit the ground. It was the only sound in the deep quiet of the tunnel. Finally, the tunnel began to go up. The floor was no longer flat. Thomas had to climb a set of narrow stone steps. At the top of the steps, there was a small wooden door. It was very old and covered in dirt. Thomas put his shoulder against the wood and pushed. The door did not move at first. He pushed harder. The door moved slowly, making a long, dry noise against the frame. Thomas stepped out into the night. He was outside the abbey walls. He looked back and realized the door was hidden behind a group of thick bushes and tall trees. From the outside, it looked like a simple part of the hill. No one would ever find it if they did not know it was there. The moon was very bright. It sat high in the sky and turned the river into a ribbon of silver. Thomas took a deep breath of the fresh, cold air. It felt much better than the dusty air of the tunnel. He looked at the ground near the hidden door. The grass was flattened. Someone had been here very recently. He walked a few steps toward the river. Between the door and the water, there was a large bush with long, sharp thorns. Thomas stopped. Something was caught on one of the thorns. It was a small piece of cloth. He reached out and pulled it away carefully. The cloth was not rough wool. It was not the kind of fabric a common thief or a traveler would wear. It was deep blue silk. It felt very smooth and expensive between his fingers. Thomas held it up to the moonlight. The color was beautiful and rich. He felt a sudden shock. He remembered the dinner at the castle. He remembered Lady Isabella. She was wearing a dress made of this exact blue silk. Could it be? Thomas whispered to himself. His mind began to race. Sister Elena said she heard a woman's voice in the garden. She said the woman sounded like a noble. Now, Thomas had a piece of blue silk from a hidden tunnel that led directly into the abbey. It seemed impossible. Why would the sister of Sir Richard steal a religious relic? She was already rich. She lived in a beautiful castle. Thomas looked toward the river. He saw the dark shape of a small boat tied to a tree. The boat was empty, but there were fresh marks in the mud next to it. The thief and his partner were using the river to move the gold. He put the piece of blue silk into his pocket. He had to be very careful now. If Lady Isabella was involved, the danger was much greater than he thought. He was not just looking for a criminal. He was looking for the most powerful woman in the valley. Thomas stood very still by the river. The piece of blue silk was safe in his pocket. He looked at the small boat tied to the tree. Suddenly, he heard a noise near the bushes. It was the sound of heavy boots breaking dry sticks on the ground. Thomas hid behind a large oak tree. He watched and waited. A man walked out of the shadows. He was very tall and had a thick, brown beard. He wore a dark cloak, but the hood was down. Thomas recognized him immediately. This was the traveler from the Broken Oak Inn. The man looked nervous. He kept looking back toward the abbey on the hill. The man was carrying a large sack made of rough cloth. The sack looked heavy. Every time the man moved, the object inside made a dull, metallic sound against his back. Thomas was sure it was the golden box. The man walked toward a black horse that was tied to a nearby fence. "Stop!" Thomas shouted. He stepped out from behind the tree. The man jumped in surprise. He looked at Thomas with wide, angry eyes. He saw that Thomas was alone and only carried a small candle and a piece of paper. The man did not look afraid for long. Instead, he looked determined to escape. "Stay away, scribe!" the man shouted. His voice was rough and loud. "This is not your business. Go back to your books before you get hurt." "You have the relic," Thomas said. He took a step forward, but he stayed a safe distance away. "The abbot knows you were in the library. I found your map and your hammer. You cannot hide." The man laughed. It was a short, mean sound. "The abbot knows nothing, and you are too late." The man quickly jumped onto his black horse. He pulled the leather reins, and the horse moved its head and breathed heavily. The man hit the side of the horse with his boots. The animal started to run very fast. The sound of the horse's hooves was loud against the soft earth. It moved away from the river and toward the north road. Thomas tried to run after him, but a man on foot could not catch a fast horse. He watched as the traveler disappeared into the dark forest. The dust from the road hung in the air for a few moments. Thomas felt a mix of frustration and excitement. He did not catch the thief, but he knew who the man was. He also knew the thief was heading north toward the city of Oak Haven. But there was one thing that confused him. If the man had the relic in his sack, why was he leaving now? And why did he leave a piece of Lady Isabella's dress near the secret door? He looked at the mud on his own boots. He was tired and cold, but he could not stop. He had to return to the village and find a horse. He needed to follow the man before the tracks disappeared in the wind. The mystery was moving away from the abbey and into the wild woods. Thomas stood on the road, breathing hard. The sound of the black horse grew quieter and quieter until it was gone. The forest felt very big and very dark. Suddenly, the wind changed. It became cold and smelled like wet earth. Above, the silver moon disappeared behind a wall of heavy, black clouds. A single drop of water hit Thomas on the forehead. Then another hit his hand. Within a minute, the sky opened. A cold, heavy rain began to fall. The rain was so thick that Thomas could not see more than a few meters in front of him. "No," Thomas whispered. He looked at the ground. This was a disaster. The rain was turning the dry dust of the road into thick, liquid mud. The tracks of the black horse were melting away. The deep marks of the heavy boots were filling with water. If he did not act quickly, every sign of the thief would be lost forever. Thomas began to walk back toward the village as fast as he could. The rain soaked through his thin wool tunic. It felt like ice against his skin. His boots became heavy with the red mud of the riverbank. Every step was a struggle. The world was now a blur of grey water and dark trees. He reached the Broken Oak Inn. The windows were dark, but a small light burned inside. Thomas did not go to the front door. He went around to the side where the small stable was located. He needed a horse. He had a few silver coins that the abbot gave him for the investigation. Inside the stable, the air was warm and smelled of dry hay. 3 horses were resting in their wooden stalls. Thomas found Robert, the innkeeper, sitting on a pile of straw. He was holding a lantern. "Thomas," Robert said. He looked shocked. "You look like a drowned rat. What are you doing out in this storm?" "Robert, I need a horse," Thomas said. He was shivering. The man with the brown beard, the traveler. He just fled toward the north road. "He has the relic. I must follow him before the rain washes away his trail." Robert stood up. He looked worriedly at the door. "In this weather?" "The north road is dangerous, Thomas. The river is rising, and the mud will be up to the horse's knees. You should wait for the morning." "I cannot wait," Thomas insisted. He pulled 2 silver coins from his pocket. "The king's cousin arrives in 2 days. If I do not have the box by then, the abbey is lost." Robert sighed. He took the coins and led a sturdy brown pony from its stall. "This is Barnaby. He is not fast, but he is strong. He knows the forest paths well. But be careful, Thomas. The rain makes the shadows play tricks on your eyes." Thomas climbed onto the horse's back. He did not have a saddle, only a simple blanket and a rope. He looked out at the curtain of rain. He felt small and very cold. But in his pocket, the piece of blue silk and the map were safe. He kicked the horse's sides, and Barnaby walked out into the storm. The first phase of his journey was over. Now, he was entering the deep woods, where the law of the abbey did not reach. The rain did not stop. It fell in long, cold sheets that blurred the world. Thomas sat low on Barnaby's back, his head tucked into his chest to stay warm. The brown pony moved slowly through the forest. The trees looked like giant, dark ghosts in the storm. The path was no longer a path. It was a river of thick, brown soup. Thomas watched the ground carefully. He was looking for any sign of the black horse. Because of the heavy rain, he could not see the hoof prints anymore. However, he could see broken branches and deep ruts in the mud where a heavy animal had struggled to stay upright. The thief was moving fast, but the mud was slowing him down. Suddenly, Barnaby stopped. He moved his ears back and forth and made a low, nervous sound. "What is it, boy?" Thomas whispered. He looked ahead. The path went down a small hill toward a narrow stream. Usually, this stream was only a few inches deep. Today, it was a rushing torrent of grey water. In the middle of the path, near the water's edge, Thomas saw something dark. It was a large shape, half buried in the mud. Thomas climbed down from the pony. His boots sank deep into the cold earth. He walked toward the object. It was a heavy leather stolbag. It was torn at the side, as if it had fallen off a horse in a great hurry. Thomas pulled it out of the mud. It was very heavy. He opened the bag with shaking fingers. Inside, he found several heavy stones. He frowned. Why would a thief carry a bag of stones? Then, he reached deeper. His fingers touched something cold and hard. He pulled it out. It was a silver candlestick with the mark of the abbey on the bottom. He is losing his cargo, Thomas realized. The thief was carrying too much weight. The mud was a trap. To move faster and escape the rising water, the man had to throw away the heavy things he stole. Thomas looked around the area. If the candlestick was here, maybe the golden box was nearby too. He began to search the mud near the stream. He used a long stick to poke at the deep puddles. The rain hit his face, making it hard to see. After a few minutes, the stick hit something solid. It was not a rock, it made a hollow, wooden sound. Thomas knelt down in the water. He reached into the cold mud and pulled. Slowly, a square object appeared. It was a wooden box covered in leather. It was not the golden box of the relic. Thomas felt a wave of disappointment. But when he wiped away the mud, he saw a familiar symbol carved into the wood. It was the circle with the vertical line. He opened the box. It did not contain gold or jewels. Instead, it was full of old letters and wax seals. These were private documents. Thomas recognized the seal of Sir Richard and the seal of the bishop. He realized then that the thief was not just stealing gold. He was stealing secrets. This box was full of information that could destroy families or change the laws of the land. Thomas put the wooden box under his arm. He had to get back to Barnaby. The water in the stream was rising higher every minute, and the ground was starting to move under his feet. The rain was still falling when Thomas reached a small clearing in the woods. Near a group of dead willow trees, there was an old stone structure. It was a very old well. The stones were covered in green moss and slippery mud. This well was built many years ago, long before the abbey was finished. Most people in the village thought the water was bad, so they stayed away. Thomas stopped Barnaby. He felt a strange feeling in his chest. He looked at the ground near the well. The mud here was very disturbed. There were deep marks where a horse had stood for a long time. He also saw a path of flattened grass leading directly to the stone edge of the well. Did he stop here? Thomas asked himself. He climbed down from the pony. His legs were tired and his clothes were heavy with water. He walked to the well and looked over the edge. It was very deep and very dark. He could not see the bottom, but he could smell the old, stagnant water below. Thomas noticed something strange. A thick hemp rope was tied to a large iron ring on the side of the well. The rope went down into the darkness. It was not an old rope. It was clean and dry at the top. This rope was put here recently. He put the wooden box of documents safely on a dry stone. Then, he grabbed the rope with both hands. He pulled. The rope was incredibly heavy. Thomas had to plant his boots firmly in the mud. He pulled again, using all the strength in his back and arms. Slowly, inch by inch, something began to rise from the depths of the well. The work was very hard. Thomas was breathing fast, and his muscles began to ache. Finally, a large, dark object appeared at the top of the well. It was a heavy iron bucket, but it was not full of water. It was wrapped in a thick, oiled leather cloth to keep it dry. Thomas lifted the heavy bundle onto the stone ledge. He untied the wet knots of the leather. Inside the leather, he found a metal chest. It was not the golden box of the relic, but it was very expensive. It was made of black iron with silver decorations. He opened the lid. The chest was full of heavy silver coins and small bags of salt. In the middle of the coins, there was a small piece of parchment. Thomas picked up the paper. It had a list of names. He recognized many of the names. They were the names of the most important men in the village and the nearby town. Next to each name was a number. "This is a list of debts," Thomas whispered. He realized that someone was using the stolen gold and these records to control the people of the valley. This was not just a theft. It was a plan to own the village. Thomas looked at the bottom of the list. There was a signature. It was not a name, but a small drawing. It was the circle with the vertical line. Suddenly, Barnaby moved his head quickly. Thomas turned around. The forest was silent, but he felt a pair of eyes watching him from the shadows of the willow trees. He realized he was not alone. Thomas did not stay at the old well. He felt the danger in the air. He quickly put the iron chest and the wooden box into Barnaby's large saddlebags. He climbed onto the pony and rode back toward the abbey. The rain was finally stopping, but the sky remained a heavy grey. He arrived at the abbey gates just as the sun began to peek through the clouds. He was cold, hungry, and covered in mud. He decided to go to the abbey kitchen. It was the warmest place in the building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fresh bread and onion soup. Huge iron pots hung over a large fire. The head cook, a tall man named Brother Simon, was busy cutting vegetables with a large knife. "Thomas," Simon said. He looked at Thomas's wet clothes. "You look like you fell into the river. Sit by the fire. I will give you a bowl of hot soup." Thomas sat on a wooden bench near the flames. As he ate the soup, he listened to the workers in the kitchen. 2 men were cleaning a large wooden table in the corner. They were talking quietly, but the room was small, and Thomas could hear every word. "I tell you, I heard them," the first man said. He was a young worker from the village. "It was late last night. I was bringing the extra flour to the cellar. I heard a man and a woman arguing near the back door." "Who was it?" the second man asked. "I did not see their faces," the worker replied. "The woman was very angry. She said, 'The gold is not enough. We need the documents. Without the papers, the Lord cannot control the bishop.' And then the man said, 'The scribe is looking in the wrong places. He will never find the well.'" Thomas stopped eating. His spoon hit the bottom of the wooden bowl. He looked at the worker. The man was right. The documents he found in the mud and the list of debts from the well were the real prizes. The golden relic was only a distraction. Someone wanted to use the documents to blackmail the leaders of the church. "Did you hear anything else?" Thomas asked, standing up. The worker looked surprised. He looked at Brother Simon, then back at Thomas. The woman said one more thing. She said the final piece is hidden in the stables. She said it must be gone before the king's cousin arrives tomorrow. Thomas felt a jolt of energy. The final piece. Maybe that was the sacred relic itself. The thief did not take it to the city. He hid it right here, under their noses, while everyone was looking in the forest. "Thank you," Thomas said. He left his soup and ran out of the kitchen. He had to get to the stables before the sun went down. Thomas ran through the wet courtyard. His boots splashed in the puddles. He wanted to reach the stables quickly, but his body was very tired. He was shivering from the cold rain. As he passed the small stone archway near the library, a man stepped out from the shadows. It was a servant named Miles. He worked for Sir Richard at the castle, but he was helping the monks today. Miles was a quiet man with a very small nose and very large ears. He was holding a silver tray with a single metal cup on it. "Master Thomas." Miles called out. "Wait a moment. You look like you are made of ice. The abbot saw you from the window. He sent me with this cup of warm spiced wine. He says it will help your heart." Thomas stopped. His throat was very dry and his chest felt cold. The smell of the wine was wonderful. It smelled of cinnamon, cloves, and sweet honey. The steam rose from the cup in the cool evening air. He reached out his hand to take the cup. "That is very kind of the abbot," Thomas said. He felt grateful. He was so thirsty. He lifted the cup to his lips. But then, he remembered something. He remembered Sister Elena's voice in the infirmary. He remembered the empty jar of sleep dust. He remembered the strange, sweet smell of the wine the gatekeeper drank. Thomas stopped. He did not drink. He looked at the wine closely. In the light of the torches on the wall, he saw something strange. There was a tiny bit of white powder on the edge of the metal cup. It looked like salt, but it did not melt into the liquid. Thomas looked at Miles. The servant was watching him very closely. His eyes were wide and he looked nervous. He was twisting his hands together. "Is something wrong, Master Thomas?" Miles asked. His voice was higher than normal. "It is very hot." Thomas replied. "I will wait a minute." A small grey rat ran across the stone floor near their feet. It was looking for pieces of bread. Thomas looked at the rat. Then he looked at the cup. He tilted the cup and poured a small amount of the wine onto the floor. The rat ran to the purple liquid and began to drink. A few seconds later, the rat stopped moving. It did not die, but it fell onto its side. Its eyes closed, and it entered a very deep sleep. It looked like a small stone on the floor. Thomas looked up at Miles. His face was full of anger. The abbot did not send this, did he? Miles did not answer. His face turned very pale. He dropped the silver tray. Miles turned around and ran. He ran toward the back gates and disappeared into the darkness of the woods. Thomas stood alone. His heart was beating very fast. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. The enemy was not just watching him. They were trying to stop him. They were trying to put him to sleep so he could not find the relic. He poured the rest of the wine onto the ground. He did not have time to chase Miles. He had to get to the stables. The final piece was there, and the sun was almost gone. He held his empty hands tight and walked toward the wooden doors of the stable. Thomas reached the heavy wooden doors of the stables. The air inside was warm and smelled of dry grass and large animals. Most of the horses were sleeping, but a few moved their heads and breathed loudly when they saw his light. In the corner of the stable, a man was sitting on a tall stool. He held a long wooden spear and a lantern. This was Silas, the night watchman. Silas was a tall man with a very long face and a grey beard. He looked tired. He spent every night walking around the abbey to make sure everything was safe. Thomas walked over to him. "Good evening, Silas." Thomas said, "I need to ask you about the night the relic was stolen." Silas looked up. He moved his spear to the side. "I already told the guards everything, Thomas. I did not see the thief enter the chapel." "I know," Thomas replied. "But did you see anything strange here, in the stables? I heard that something was hidden here." Silas rubbed his eyes. He thought for a long moment. "Well, there was one thing. It was around midnight. The fog was very thick. I was standing near the back door. I heard the sound of a horse's metal shoes on the stones. It was very quiet, as if the person was trying to be a ghost." "Did you see the rider?" Thomas asked. "No," Silas said. "The fog was like a wall, but I saw the shape of a black horse. The rider led the horse into the very last stall. That stall is usually empty because the wood is old and the roof has a hole. I thought it was a traveler who did not want to pay for a room at the inn." Thomas felt his heart beat faster. The last stall. Did the horse stay there long? "Only for 10 minutes," Silas answered. The man came out and walked toward the abbey garden. Then, a few minutes later, he came back. He was carrying a large object. He put it on the horse and rode away through the back gate. But before he left, he spent some time in the corner of that stall. He was moving a lot of hay. Thomas thanked the watchman and walked toward the back of the stables. The last stall was dark and full of shadows. The wooden walls were rotting and smelled of damp earth. Thomas knelt on the floor. He pushed away the yellow hay with his hands. He found the ground under the hay. It was not stone like the rest of the stable. It was made of flat wooden boards. Thomas touched the boards. One board felt loose. He used his small knife to lift the edge of the wood. Under the board, there was a small hole. Thomas reached inside. His fingers touched something cold and hard. He pulled it out. It was a silver bit for a horse's mouth. It was beautiful and very expensive. On the side of the silver, there was a small symbol. It was a circle with a vertical line through the center. The horse belongs to the person who marked the walls. Thomas whispered. He realized the watchman saw the thief. But more importantly, the thief left the bit behind. Why? Perhaps the horse was hurt, or perhaps the bit was a signal for someone else. Thomas looked deeper into the hole. He saw a piece of parchment. He pulled it out and opened it. It was a list of times and dates. The last date on the list was tomorrow. Thomas left the stables quickly. The night air was very cold now, and the moon was hidden by moving clouds. He held the silver horse bit and the small list of dates tightly in his hand. He felt like he was walking through a forest of lies. Every time he found a clue, it led him back to the abbey walls. He realized that the thief was not just visiting. The thief was living among them. He decided to return to the guest wing. This was the building where the traveler stayed and where Thomas found the secret tunnel. He entered the long, quiet hallway. The floor was made of grey stone, and the walls were covered in old, heavy tapestries. These were large cloths with pictures of history and kings. They were very thick and kept the heat inside the rooms. Thomas walked slowly. He looked at each tapestry. He was looking for something strange. He reached a large tapestry at the end of the hall. It showed a group of men hunting a large deer in a green forest. Thomas stopped. He noticed a small movement at the bottom of the heavy cloth. There was no wind in the hallway, and the windows were all closed. He walked closer and put his hand on the fabric. The wool felt cold and dusty. He felt a very light movement of air against his skin. It was coming from behind the tapestry. Thomas grabbed the edge of the heavy cloth and pulled it to the side. Behind the tapestry, the stone wall was not solid. There was a small, narrow door made of dark oak wood. It did not have a handle or a lock. It only had a small iron ring. Thomas pulled the ring. The door made a long, dry scraping noise against the stone floor. But it opened. Thomas stepped inside. It was a very tiny room. It was not a bedroom. It was a secret place for watching. There was a small hole in the wall. When Thomas looked through the hole, he could see the entire library. He could see the abbot's desk and the shelves of books. Someone was watching the abbot. Thomas whispered. In the center of the tiny room, there was a small wooden table. A single candle sat in a metal holder. Thomas touched the wax. It was still soft and warm. Someone was in this secret room only a few minutes ago. They left in a hurry when they heard Thomas in the hallway. He looked at the table. He found a small piece of blue silk ribbon. It was the same beautiful blue as Lady Isabella's dress. Next to the ribbon, there was a letter. The paper was expensive and white. Thomas read the words. "The plan is ready. The bishop will arrive with the king's cousin. When the relic is not found, the abbot will lose his power. Sir Richard will take the land. The documents from the well are safe. Do not let the scribe find the final piece." Thomas felt a wave of fear. This was a conspiracy. The Lord and his sister were working together to destroy the abbey. They wanted the land and the power. And now, they knew he was close to the truth. He heard a light footstep in the hallway outside. He quickly pushed the door shut and stayed in the dark, silent room. Thomas stayed in the tiny, dark room for a long time. He did not move. He listened to the footsteps in the hallway. The sound grew quieter and finally stopped. Thomas waited 5 more minutes. Then, he pushed the secret door open very slowly. The hallway was empty. The hunters on the tapestry looked at him with silent eyes. He knew he had to go back to the stables. He had the silver horse bit in his pocket. He also had the piece of blue silk ribbon. He needed to find the horse that belonged to the bit. If he found the horse, he would find the owner of the blue cloak. The night was very dark. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and slippery. Thomas walked through the courtyard. He stayed close to the stone walls to avoid the moonlight. He reached the stables and entered quietly. Silas, the watchman, was now walking around the great chapel. The stables were empty of people. Thomas went to the first stall. A large brown horse stood there. It was a calm animal. Thomas looked at its head. The bit in its mouth was made of plain iron. He moved to the second stall. This horse belonged to a traveler. Its equipment was old and dirty. He walked past many horses. Finally, he reached the stall of a beautiful black horse. This animal was tall and its skin was shiny. This was the horse that the man with the brown beard used to flee toward the woods. But wait, the man had ridden away. Why was the horse back in the stable? Did the thief return? Thomas whispered. He looked at the horse's head. It did not have a bit or a bridle. Thomas took the silver bit from his pocket. He compared the symbol on the metal to the mark on the horse's leather saddle. They were identical. This was the horse from the river. The thief had come back to the abbey in secret. Thomas looked around the stall. He saw a large wooden chest in the corner. The chest was locked, but the wood was old. Thomas used a heavy stone from the floor to hit the lock. The metal snapped. He opened the lid. Inside the chest, he found a heavy cloak. It was not the dark cloak of the traveler. It was a bright, expensive blue cloak. It was made of the same silk as the ribbon from the secret room. Under the cloak, there was a pair of leather boots. They were covered in red mud from the river. Thomas felt a cold realization. The thief was not a stranger from a distant city. The thief was someone who lived in the castle but stayed at the abbey often. He looked at the inside of the blue cloak. There was a small name written in gold thread. The name was not Isabella. It was a man's name. It was the name of Sir Richard's captain of the guards. Thomas heard a noise behind him. A horse moved its feet quickly. He turned around. A tall man stood in the doorway of the stable. The man wore armor that reflected the moonlight. He held a long sword in his hand. It was the captain of the guards. The captain of the guards walked slowly into the stable. His name was Captain Baldwin. He was a very tall man with broad shoulders and a face that never smiled. He held his long, silver sword in his right hand. The metal of the sword was cold and sharp. He pointed it directly at Thomas's chest. "You are a very curious scribe, Thomas," Captain Baldwin said. His voice was deep and very calm. This made Thomas even more afraid. But curiosity is a dangerous thing for a man who only knows how to use a pen. Thomas felt the cold stone of the stable wall against his back. He was trapped. "I found your cloak, Captain. I found the red mud on your boots. You were the man at the river. You were the man who broke the abbey gates." The captain took a step closer. The light from the moon came through the hole in the roof. It hit his metal armor. "I am a soldier, Thomas. I do what I am told. The abbot is old and weak. This land needs a strong leader like Sir Richard. The documents I took from the well will prove that the abbey belongs to the castle." "And the golden relic?" Thomas asked. "Where is the box?" The captain narrowed his eyes. "That is not your concern. You will not live long enough to find it." As the captain raised his sword, a horse in the next stall moved suddenly. It was the large black horse. The animal was nervous and hit the wooden wall with its heavy hooves. The sudden movement surprised the captain. He turned his head for a second. In that moment, a small leather pouch on the captain's belt broke. It hit the floor. Many small objects spilled into the straw. The captain looked down and became very angry. He quickly knelt to pick them up. Thomas saw his chance. He did not run yet. He looked at the floor near his feet. One object had rolled away from the others. It was a silver coin. But it was not a coin from this kingdom. Thomas reached down and grabbed it. He put it in his pocket quickly. "Give that back!" the captain shouted. He stood up and swung his sword. Thomas moved fast. He was thin and light. He jumped over a pile of hay and ran toward the back door of the stable. He did not look back. He heard the captain's heavy armor making a loud noise as he tried to follow. Thomas ran into the dark courtyard. He knew the abbey better than the captain. He turned into a narrow passage between the kitchen and the chapel. He stopped in the shadows and caught his breath. He pulled the silver coin from his pocket. He held it up to his eyes. The coin was beautiful. It had a picture of a large bird with two heads. Thomas knew a lot about geography from his books. This coin was from the eastern lands, many hundreds of miles away. Why does the captain have foreign money? Thomas whispered. This was a new mystery. The eastern lands were famous for their spices, their silk, and their spies. Thomas realized the plan was much bigger than just Sir Richard. There were people from other countries involved in the theft. He had to show this coin to the abbot immediately. But first, he had to hide from the captain's guards. Thomas moved through the shadows of the abbey. He stayed very close to the cold stone walls. He did not go to the library. He was afraid that Captain Baldwin and his guards were waiting for him there. Instead, he went to the small stone house near the garden. This was where Brother John lived. Brother John was the old monk who saw the tall shadow on the first morning. Thomas hoped the old man knew more. He reached the door and pushed it open very slowly. The room was small and smelled of dried lavender. A single candle burned on a wooden table. Brother John was sitting on his bed. He was holding a small wooden cross and praying. "Brother John," Thomas whispered. The old man looked up. His eyes were wide with fear. "Thomas, you must be careful. The air in the abbey is full of poison tonight. I see the guards everywhere. They are not looking for a thief. They are looking for you." Thomas sat on a small stool. He pulled the silver coin with the two-headed bird from his pocket. He showed it to the monk. "I found this in the stables. It fell from Captain Baldwin's belt. Do you know what it is?" Brother John took the coin. His hands shook as he touched the silver. He looked at it for a long time. Then, he looked at Thomas with a very serious face. "This is money from the great city in the east. It is very far away. Many years ago, before I was a monk, I was a traveler. I saw these coins in the hands of spies and merchants." "Why does the captain have it?" Thomas asked. "Because the captain is not working alone." Brother John replied quietly. "Listen to me, Thomas. I did not tell you everything before. I was too afraid. On the night the relic was stolen, I did not just see a shadow. I heard voices near the garden wall. There were 3 people." Thomas leaned forward. 3 people. "Yes," John said. "There was the captain. There was a woman. I think it was Lady Isabella. But there was a third man. He spoke a language I did not know. He had a very deep voice. He gave a heavy bag to the captain. The metal inside the bag made a ringing noise. It was full of these silver coins." Thomas felt a cold chill. This was not just about Sir Richard wanting land. He was selling the secrets of the kingdom to people from the east. The final piece was probably a secret map or a letter that the foreigners wanted. "You must tell the abbot," Thomas said. Suddenly, the silence of the night was broken. Thomas heard the sound of heavy boots on the stone path outside. The sound was fast and rhythmic. Many men were coming. "They are here," Brother John whispered. He pointed to a small window at the back of the room. "Go, Thomas. They want the scribe, not an old monk. Take the coin and find the abbot. I will try to stop them." "I cannot leave you, John," Thomas said. "Go." The monk insisted. Thomas heard the sound of a heavy hand hitting the wooden door. The wood made a loud, hollow noise. Thomas climbed through the small window and dropped into the wet grass of the garden. He heard the door of the house break open. He heard the captain's loud voice, but he did not wait to hear more. He ran into the darkness, his heart heavy with worry for the old monk. Thomas ran through the abbey garden, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The moon had finally broken through the clouds, bathing the stone walls in a cold, silver light. It was beautiful, but for Thomas, it was dangerous. Every open space was a trap where the guards could see him. He heard the shouting of men behind him. They were calling his name. Captain Baldwin's voice was the loudest, a deep growl echoing off the library walls. Thomas knew he couldn't reach the abbot's quarters. The main path was blocked by soldiers in yellow and black. He veered left, toward the great bell tower. It was the tallest structure in the abbey, a square stone giant that reached toward the stars. The wooden door at the base was small and thick. Thomas slipped inside and shoved the heavy iron bolt into place just as a pair of boots thudded against the grass outside. The ascent. The air inside the tower was ancient and smelled of dry wood and bird feathers. It was pitch black. Thomas felt for the stone wall and found the start of the spiral staircase. He climbed quickly, his hands grazing the rough, cold stones. 10 steps. His legs felt like lead. 30 steps. He heard the guards beating on the door below. 50 steps. The sound of the wind began to whistle through the narrow arrow-slit windows. Finally, he reached the belfry. The massive bronze bell hung in the center of the room, a silent monster of metal. Thomas collapsed against the wooden frame, gasping for air. He pulled the silver coin from his pocket. In the dim light, the two-headed bird seemed to stare at him. A view from above. Thomas crawled to the edge of the open window and looked down. From here, the abbey looked like a toy village. To the north, he saw the torches of a long procession of horses and carriages. The king's cousin, the duke, was arriving early. In the courtyard, he saw Sir Richard and Lady Isabella standing near the main gate. They were dressed in their finest clothes, ready to welcome the duke with lies. Near the stables, a small fire was burning. The guards were destroying evidence. Thomas looked around the belfry. He noticed something strange on the floor near the bell's heavy rope. There were fresh scratches in the wood, and a small trail of golden dust. He looked up at the bell itself. It was huge and hollow. Thomas stood on his tiptoes and reached his hand into the dark interior of the bell, feeling along the inner rim. His fingers hit something cold, smooth, and rectangular. It was wedged between the clapper and the side of the bell. With a grunt of effort, he pulled. A heavy object fell into his arms, nearly knocking him over. It was wrapped in a dirty monk's habit. Thomas unwrapped the cloth. The moonlight hit the object, and for a moment, the belfry was filled with a warm, golden glow. It was the relic of St. Jude. The golden box was encrusted with rubies and emeralds, and it hummed with a strange, quiet power. But as Thomas touched the lid, he realized the box was slightly open. The thief hadn't just stolen the relic. They had used the box to hide something else. Inside, resting on top of the sacred bone of the saint, was a rolled-up scroll sealed with the black wax of the eastern lands. Thomas heard a creak on the stairs. Someone hadn't bothered with the door. They had climbed the outside of the tower. A hand gripped the stone ledge of the window. The fingers gripping the stone were scarred and thick. Slowly, a head appeared above the ledge. It wasn't Captain Baldwin. This man had a face as sharp as a hawk's, with eyes that seemed to catch what little light remained in the belfry. He wore a tunic of dark, quilted silk, practical for a climber, but clearly foreign. This was the third man Brother John had whispered about. Thomas backed away, clutching the golden relic to his chest. He felt the heavy weight of the secret scroll inside it. The scribe wasn't a man of war. His hands were meant for ink and parchment, not for wrestling assassins on the edge of a precipice. The scroll, scribe, the man said. His voice was a low, rasping melody. His accent was thick, the words rolling like stones in a river. Give it to me, and you may live to write another book. Refuse, and you will learn how fast a man falls from such a height. Thomas looked at the staircase door. It was still bolted from the inside, but he could hear Baldwin's men throwing themselves against it. He was trapped between a soldier's hammer and a spy's blade. This scroll, Thomas said, his voice trembling but clear. It contains the names of the men Sir Richard is selling the kingdom to, doesn't it? It isn't just a map. It's a list of traitors. The stranger smiled, showing teeth that had seen many distant lands. It is a new world being born, little monk. One where kings are replaced by those with the most silver. Now, step away from the bell. The great bronze voice. Thomas looked at the massive bell hanging beside him. He realized why the thief had hidden the relic here. No one ever rang the great bell except for the arrival of royalty or the death of an abbot. It was the perfect hiding spot. Until tonight. The stranger lunged forward, a curved dagger appearing in his hand like magic. Thomas didn't think. He reacted. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the thick, hempen rope that hung from the center of the beam. With a roar of effort that burned his lungs, Thomas threw his entire body weight onto the rope. The sound was cataclysmic. Inside the small stone room, the noise didn't just vibrate. It hit like a physical blow. The air itself seemed to shatter. The stranger, caught mid-leap, was knocked sideways by the sheer wall of sound. He dropped his dagger, clutching his ears in agony. Thomas pulled again. Below in the courtyard, the sound would be a thunderclap. The Duke, currently stepping out of his carriage, would hear the royal welcome. The abbot would know something was terribly wrong. Sir Richard's face would surely be turning as white as his silk collar. The stranger stumbled, his balance gone. He reached for the ledge to steady himself, but his hands were trembling too much. With a final, desperate look at the golden box, he scrambled back over the window's edge, disappearing into the darkness of the outer wall like a spider. The evidence in hand. Thomas collapsed to the floor, his ears ringing so loudly he could hear nothing else. He was dizzy, and the world felt like it was spinning. But he held the relic tight. The door to the belfry finally splintered open. It wasn't the captain who burst through. It was the abbot, followed by two of the Duke's royal guards in shining silver plate armor. They looked at the disheveled scribe, the golden box, and the heavy bell still swaying. "Thomas," the abbot whispered, though Thomas could only see his lips move. Thomas reached into the golden box and pulled out the scroll with the black wax seal. He held it up for the Duke's guards to see. "The truth," Thomas croaked. "It's all here." The great hall of the abbey was no longer a place of quiet prayer. It was filled with the Duke's royal guards, their silver armor reflecting the light of 100 candles. The Duke himself, a man with a stern face and a long purple cloak, sat at the abbot's table. Before him lay the golden relic, the silver bit from the stables, the blue silk ribbon, and, most importantly, the scroll with the black wax seal. Sir Richard and Lady Isabella stood in the center of the room, surrounded by guards. Richard's face was red with anger, while Isabella remained perfectly still, her eyes like chips of cold flint. "This is a mistake," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "That scribe is a thief and a liar. He stole those items to frame us." The Duke did not look up. He was reading the scroll. As his eyes moved across the parchment, his face grew darker. Finally, he looked at Sir Richard. "The names on this list." "Richard," the Duke said, his voice like grinding stones. "The bishop." the Earl of Oakhaven, even my own treasurer, all promised to the Sultan of the East in exchange for gold and power. And here, in your own hand, is the map of the coastal defenses." Isabella stepped forward, her voice sharp. "My brother is a fool, but he is no traitor. That scroll was planted by—" "Enough, Isabella," the Duke interrupted. He held up the blue silk ribbon Thomas had found. "A piece of your dress was found at the secret tunnel, and Captain Baldwin has already confessed. He was not just your soldier, he was your messenger to the spies." With a wave of the Duke's hand, the guards moved forward. Sir Richard collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, while Isabella was led away, her head held high even in defeat. A quiet dawn. The next morning, the sun rose over a peaceful abbey. The red mud of the riverbank was drying, and the sleep dust had finally worn off Brother Peter, who was very embarrassed but healthy. Thomas sat at his desk in the library. His ears were still ringing slightly from the great bell, and his muscles ached. But he held a new pen in his hand, a gift from the Duke. The abbot walked into the room, looking younger than he had in weeks. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You saved more than just a box of gold, Thomas," the abbot said quietly. "You saved the kingdom from a war we were not prepared to fight. St. Jude would be proud of his scribe." "I only followed the ink, Father," Thomas replied with a small smile. "Clues are just letters. You just have to know how to read them." The golden relic was back in its stone niche, safe behind a new, much stronger iron gate. The maps were returned to their shelves, and the secret tunnel had been filled with solid stone. Thomas looked out the window at the village of Blackwood. He saw the Broken Oak Inn and the blacksmith shop. Life was returning to normal. He picked up a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped his pen into the ink. He had a new story to write, not a ledger of grain or a copy of an old prayer, but the true account of the night the bells rang for a scribe. 3 days had passed since the Duke's arrival. The abbey was thick with the scent of beeswax and the heavy tread of royal boots. While the monks returned to their prayers, Thomas was summoned once again to the abbot's private study. To his surprise, he found the Duke there, his face illuminated by a single, flickering lamp. "The girl was right," the Duke said without preamble, gesturing to a seat. He was referring to Lady Isabella's chilling confidence during her arrest. "The scroll you found in the belfry was only half of the message. My cryptographers have spent 48 hours staring at the black wax and the ciphered text. They can read the names of the traitors, yes, but the dates and the locations are locked behind a secondary code." He pushed a small, charred scrap of vellum toward Thomas. It had been recovered from the fire the guards were stoking near the stables. This was meant to be ash, the Duke continued, but the fire was wet from the rain, and the center survived. "It's your hand, Thomas, your scribe's eye. Tell me what you see that my soldiers do not." Thomas leaned in. The parchment was scorched at the edges, the scent of smoke stinging his nose. At first glance, it looked like a simple inventory of grain shipments, but as Thomas traced the lines, he noticed a familiar irregularity. The spacing. Every fifth word had a slightly wider gap than the others. The punctuation. Small dots of ink, no larger than a needle's point, were hidden beneath the tails of the letter G. The ink. Under the lamplight, some of the letters had a faint, metallic sheen, iron gall ink mixed with something else. "It's a grid cipher," Thomas whispered. "The grain shipments are a mask. If you lay a specific template over this page, only the letters visible through the holes will form the true message." "And do you have the template?" the Duke asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, but I recognize the style. This is the work of the master scribe of Oakhaven. He was my teacher many years ago. He always taught that the best way to hide a secret was to put it in a ledger of something boring." The Duke stood up, his purple cloak swirling. "Then you must go to Oak Haven. The names on that list are already being arrested, but the final piece Isabella spoke of, the weapon or the wealth that was to trigger the coup, is still out there, and it is moving toward the capital." Thomas felt a cold pit in his stomach. He was a man of the library, not the road. But as he looked at the abbot, who nodded slowly, he knew his life as a simple scribe was over. He was now an agent of the crown, and the road to Oak Haven was long and shadowed. Leaving the abbey felt like leaving a part of his own soul behind. Thomas stood at the gates at dawn, a sturdy pack on his back and the Duke's seal hidden in a secret pocket of his tunic. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the very stone of the mountains. "This is Elias," the Duke had explained the night before. "He was my finest scout until a spear found his leg in the border wars. He walks with a limp now, but his eyes are sharper than a hawk's, and his sword is still fast." Elias was a man of few words. He patted the neck of a large, grey horse and looked at Thomas with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You look like you've never sat on a horse for more than an hour, scribe." "I prefer walking," Thomas admitted, adjusting his spectacles. "It allows for better observation of the flora." Elias snorted. "The only flora you'll need to observe is the kind we can hide in if Baldwin's men, the ones who escaped, decide to take their revenge. They know you're the reason their captain is in chains." They set off as the morning mist clung to the trees of Blackwood. The path was narrow, winding through the dense forest that bordered the river. Thomas tried to focus on the rhythm of his pony, Barnaby, but his mind kept returning to the scorched parchment. "Elias," Thomas said after an hour of silence. The Duke mentioned the Shadow Court. "What is it?" The scout didn't look back. "It's a ghost story for lords. They say that for every king sitting on a throne, there is a man in the shadows holding the strings. Merchants, goldsmiths, even high-ranking priests. They don't care about flags or crowns. They only care about the flow of silver. If the eastern lands are involved, it means the Shadow Court has decided our kingdom is ripe for the picking." As they reached a fork in the road, Elias suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. Thomas froze. From the bushes to their right, they heard a soft, rhythmic clicking sound. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a crossbow being cocked. "Down!" Elias roared. An arrow hissed through the air exactly where Thomas's head had been a second before. It thudded into a tree trunk. Elias was off his horse in an instant, his sword clearing its scabbard with a ring of steel. The quiet scribe's journey had barely begun, and already, the shadows were reaching for him. The forest was no longer a place of birdsong and rustling leaves. It had become a theater of war. Elias moved with a speed that defied his limp, a silver blur against the green backdrop. He had disappeared into the thick growth before Thomas could even regain his breath. Thomas, left alone on the path with Barnaby, felt exposed and vulnerable. He remembered the Duke's warning. "The shadows are reaching for you." Another bolt hissed through the air, this one catching the edge of Thomas's leather pack. The force of it spun him around, and he tumbled into the red mud. Panic surged, but Thomas's training as a scribe, a life spent focusing on the smallest details, kicked in. He didn't look for the archer. He looked for the source of the sound. He saw a flicker of steel behind a cluster of low-hanging ferns. Without thinking, Thomas reached into his pack. He didn't have a sword, but he had the tools of his trade. He pulled out a small glass bottle of concentrated indigo ink and a heavy metal ruler. "Elias!" "To the left!" Thomas shouted, though he wasn't sure where his companion was. As a figure in a dark, mudded tunic rose from the ferns to reload his crossbow, Thomas threw the ink bottle with all his might. It was a lucky shot. The glass shattered against the man's forehead, drenching his face and eyes in thick, staining blue liquid. The attacker cried out, clawing at his stinging eyes, his weapon firing blindly into the canopy. In an instant, Elias was there. He emerged from the undergrowth behind the man, the hilt of his sword descending in a sharp arc. The attacker went limp and slumped into the ferns. Elias stood over him, breathing heavily. He looked back at Thomas, who was still sitting in the mud, covered in indigo and earth. A slow, rare grin spread across the scout's weathered face. Indigo ink. Elias chuckled. I suppose that's one way to mark a target. It was the only thing I had. Thomas panted, wiping his spectacles. Elias hauled the unconscious man onto the path. He was a rough-looking fellow, but his gear was surprisingly high quality. Around his neck hung a small iron pendant, a circle with a vertical line through it. The mark again. Thomas whispered, standing up and brushing off his tunic. But look at his hands. Elias. Elias knelt. The man's fingers were calloused, but not from the plough or the sword. They were stained with black ink and stained with the faint scent of bitumen, a substance used by printers and master scribes to seal scrolls. He's not just a mercenary. Thomas realized. He's a courier. He was waiting for us. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to see if I had the second half of the scroll. Elias tied the prisoner to a sturdy oak tree, using the man's own crossbow string. The scout's interrogation was not loud, but it was terrifyingly quiet. He leaned in close, his voice a low rumble. We are 3 days from Oak Haven. If you tell us who sent you, you might live to see the city. If you don't, the wolves will find you before the sun sets. The man spat onto the ground. You're already dead, scribe. He rasped, looking at Thomas. The Shadow Court knows every step you take. You think you're following a trail. You're walking into a web. Thomas stepped forward, ignoring the man's threats. He began to search the prisoner's pockets. He found nothing but a few silver coins, Eastern silver, and a small, folded piece of vellum. He opened it carefully. It wasn't a letter. It was a hand-drawn map of the Oak Haven city walls, specifically the Old North Gate. There's a mark here. Thomas pointed out. A tiny red was placed near a section of the wall known as the Hollow Oak, an ancient, dead tree that had been incorporated into the masonry centuries ago. The Hollow Oak is a drop point, Elias said, his eyes narrowing. It's where spies leave messages when the city gates are too heavily guarded. Then that's where we go, Thomas said firmly. If the master scribe is involved, he might be using that tree to communicate with the Shadow Court. They left the prisoner for the Duke's men, who were following a day behind, and pushed forward. The forest began to thin, replaced by rolling hills of golden wheat. In the distance, the spires of Oak Haven rose against the horizon like a crown of stone. As they rode, Thomas couldn't shake the prisoner's words. A web. He looked at his own hands. They were stained with indigo, a mark of the fight he had just survived. He was no longer just a watcher of history. He was a participant. Elias. Thomas asked as they crested a hill. Why did the master scribe teach me the grid cipher if he was part of this? He knew I was a man of the church. Perhaps. Elias replied, looking toward the city. He wasn't teaching you how to hide secrets. Perhaps he was teaching you how to find them, in case he ever lost his way. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows over the road. Oak Haven was close, its gates a dark mouth waiting to swallow them. Thomas gripped Barnaby's reins. The final piece was somewhere inside those walls, and the clock was ticking. The city of Oak Haven was a sprawling titan of stone and timber, its high walls scarred by centuries of siege and weather. As Thomas and Elias approached the main gates, the air changed. The sweet scent of the forest was replaced by the heavy odors of coal smoke, tanned leather, and the salty tang of the nearby docks. Oak Haven was a city of trade, but today, it felt like a city of suspicion. Royal guards in the Duke's colours stood at every entrance, their eyes scanning the faces of farmers, merchants, and travellers. The news of the arrests at the Abbey had travelled fast. The Shadow Court was no longer a whisper. It was a ghost that every citizen feared. "Stay quiet," Elias muttered, pulling his cloak tighter. "The city has 1,000 ears, and half of them belong to the men we're hunting." They bypassed the crowded main thoroughfare, instead sticking to the narrow, winding alleys of the low quarter. Here, the buildings leaned toward each other like old men sharing secrets, blocking out much of the sunlight. Thomas kept his hand on his hidden pocket, feeling the weight of the Duke's seal. It was his only protection if things went wrong. They reached the inner side of the north wall by midday. The stone here was ancient, crumbling in places to reveal the rubble beneath. And there, standing like a skeletal sentinel, was the hollow oak. The tree had been dead for 100 years, its trunk fused into the masonry of the wall. Its blackened branches reached upward like twisted fingers, casting jagged shadows across the cobblestones. The red dot on the map was exactly here. Thomas whispered, his eyes tracing the line where the wood met the stone. He approached the tree with a scholar's curiosity. He wasn't looking for a door or a handle. He was looking for an irregularity in the texture. He ran his fingers over the bark, which felt like cold, dead skin. Near the base, hidden behind a thick growth of grey lichen, he found it, a small, circular knot that didn't match the growth pattern of the rest of the oak. Thomas pressed the knot. With a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, a small panel of wood slid back. It revealed a dark, narrow cavity no larger than a scroll case. Inside was a cylinder made of cold, heavy brass. It was engraved with the same symbol Thomas had seen on the wall of the Abbey and the prisoner's pendant, the circle with the vertical line. "Is that it?" Elias asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as he scanned the alleyway. "It's a cipher cylinder," Thomas said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "My teacher, the master scribe, designed these. Without the correct combination of letters, the ink inside the cylinder will spill and destroy the parchment. It's a fail-safe for the highest secrets." Suddenly, the sound of rhythmic marching echoed from the far end of the alley. A patrol of city guards was approaching, but they weren't wearing the Duke's colours. They wore the dark red of the City Watch, men who answered to the governor of Oak Haven, one of the names on the list of traitors. "Into the shadows," Elias hissed, grabbing Thomas by the shoulder and pulling him behind a stack of empty merchant crates. The patrol passed by, their iron-shod boots ringing against the stones. They didn't stop at the tree, but the leader lingered for a moment, his gaze hovering over the hollow oak before moving on. Thomas held his breath, the brass cylinder feeling like a lead weight in his hand. Once the sound of the guards faded, he turned the object over in the dim light. "I need a quiet place, Elias," Thomas whispered. "This cylinder is a puzzle. If I force it, the truth is lost forever." Elias led him deeper into the city, toward a derelict scriptorium he knew from his days as a soldier. The building was dusty and filled with the scent of rotting paper, but it provided a sanctuary from the prying eyes on the street. Thomas sat at a broken wooden desk and placed the cylinder before him. It was composed of 5 rotating rings, each etched with the alphabet of the Eastern lands. He remembered his lessons under the master scribe. The key is never the obvious word. It is the word that connects the teacher to the student. He thought of the library at St. Jude's. He thought of the first book he ever restored. He tried several words. Silence, knowledge, truth. But the rings remained locked. Then, he remembered a day years ago when he had asked his teacher why he always used iron gall ink. The master scribe had smiled and said, "Because it bites into the page, Thomas. Like memory." Thomas aligned the rings. Memory. With a soft click, the brass cylinder pulled apart. Inside was not a scroll, but a thin, translucent sheet of horn, etched with a complex grid of holes. The template. Thomas gasped. This is the grid for the scorched parchment. But look, Elias, there's a note wrapped around it. The note was written in a hurried, shaky hand. Thomas, if you find this, then the Shadow Court has already taken me. They hold me in the governor's vault beneath the citadel. The final piece is not a weapon. It is a person. A child of the royal blood they intend to use to claim the throne. Save the boy, and you save the crown. The master scribe is a prisoner. Elias said, his jaw tightening. And the final piece is a royal prince. This isn't just a coup, it's an abduction. The gravity of the situation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The simple theft of a golden box had spiraled into a conspiracy involving the kidnap of royalty and the imprisonment of his mentor. We can't go to the citadel alone. Thomas said, the governor's guards outnumber us 100 to 1. Then we don't go as soldiers. Elias replied, a dark glint in his eye. We go as ghosts. And you, scribe, are going to use that ink of yours to write us a way in. The derelict scriptorium felt like a tomb, but for Thomas, it was a sanctuary of possibility. To enter the citadel, they couldn't climb the walls, and they couldn't fight their way through the front gate. They had to walk through the front door with the permission of the governor himself, or at least, a piece of parchment that looked like it. I need the Duke's seal, Thomas said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. I have his signet impression on the letter he gave me. But to pass a citadel guard, I need a 3-dimensional seal in red wax. A flat drawing won't suffice. Elias leaned against a rotted bookshelf, watching the street through a crack in the shutters. How do you make a seal without the ring? The same way a master makes a sculpture. Thomas replied, already clearing a space on the desk. I need a lead slug, a fine-point chisel, and a steady hand. And I need a specific type of ink, one that smells of the Royal Archive. They use a mixture of lampblack and a hint of lavender oil to keep the moths away from the parchment. A guard might not know the handwriting, but he will know the scent of the palace. For the next 4 hours, Thomas disappeared into a world of minute detail. He took a lead weight from Elias's fishing kit and began to carve. His eyes, magnified by his spectacles, tracked every curve of the Duke's crest, the leaping stag and the crossed swords. Every line had to be perfect. If the stag's antlers were too short, the forgery would be spotted. To make the parchment look like it had traveled from the capital, Thomas dusted it with a fine powder of crushed charcoal and tea leaves, then held it near a candle flame to stiffen the fibers. As he worked, he drafted the letter. It was a formal order of immediate extraordinary audit. It claimed that the Duke had received reports of financial irregularities in the Oakhaven Citadel and was sending his personal auditor, Thomas, to inspect the lower vaults. Elias would play the role of the silent, intimidating bodyguard. It's done, Thomas whispered, his hands trembling as he pressed his makeshift lead seal into the bubbling red wax. He pulled it away to reveal a perfect, terrifyingly accurate impression of the Duke's authority. Elias walked over and looked at the document. He let out a low whistle. If I didn't know you were a monk, Thomas, I'd say you were the most dangerous man in this city. You haven't just written a letter, you've built a key. It's a key that only works once. Thomas warned. If they check the registry or send a messenger to the Duke's camp, we are dead men. Then we make sure they're too intimidated to check. Elias said, handing Thomas a clean, high-collared cloak he had borrowed from a nearby laundry line. Put this on. Master Auditor. It's time to go to work. The citadel of Oakhaven sat upon a high rocky outcrop, looming over the city like a stone hawk. Its walls were black with age and soot, and the main gate was a massive construction of iron-studded oak. As Thomas and Elias climbed the steep winding path, the wind began to howl, tugging at Thomas's new, stiff cloak. His heart was a frantic drum in his chest. Every step toward the gate felt like a step toward a gallows. He gripped his leather satchel, which contained the forged audit orders and his scribe's tools. "Stop!" a guard shouted. Two men in the governor's red and gold tunics stepped forward, their spears crossing to block the path. "The citadel is closed to visitors by order of Governor Vane. State your business or move on." Thomas didn't flinch. He channeled the cold, arrogant energy of the master scribe. He looked at the guards with a gaze of utter boredom and slight annoyance. "I am Thomas of St. Jude, Special Auditor to His Grace, the Duke," he said, his voice loud and clear. He didn't wait for them to respond. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the parchment, the heavy red seal dangling from the bottom. "You are blocking a royal inquiry. I suggest you move those spears before I record your names in the insubordination section of my report." The guards hesitated. They looked at each other, then at the seal. The Duke's crest was unmistakable. The governor didn't mention an audit. The lead guard muttered, though his spear point lowered slightly. "Do you think the Duke asks for the governor's permission to check his own books?" Thomas snapped. "We have traveled through the night. My guard is tired, and I am in no mood for the incompetence of a gatewatch. Open the gate, or explain to the Duke's herald why his auditor was left standing in the rain." Elias took a step forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. He didn't say a word, but his scarred face and cold eyes did the talking for him. He looked like a man who had killed many people for much smaller insults. The lead guard swallowed hard. He signaled to the men at the winch. With a slow, grinding screech, the iron gate began to rise. "My apologies, Master Auditor," the guard said, bowing his head slightly. "Pass through. Sergeant Halloway will meet you in the inner ward to escort you to the governor." "I do not need the governor yet," Thomas said as he walked past, his heart nearly leaping out of his throat. "I start in the vaults. The paperwork for the grain shipments and the prisoner logs. Lead the way to the archives." They stepped into the shadows of the citadel. They were inside, but as the heavy gate slammed shut behind them, Thomas realized they were now in the belly of the beast. The master scribe and the prince were somewhere beneath their feet, and the true test was only just beginning. The inner archives of the citadel were a labyrinth of cold stone and rotting paper. Sergeant Halloway, a man with a face like cracked leather and a suspicious glint in his eye, led them down a spiral staircase that seemed to descend into the very roots of the mountain. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of old ink. "The governor doesn't like people poking around down here," Halloway grumbled, his torch casting long, flickering shadows against the rows of wooden shelves. "The records are a mess. We haven't had a proper clerk in months." "Which is exactly why the Duke sent me," Thomas replied, his voice echoing with practiced authority. "Incompetence is the breeding ground for corruption. Sergeant, now, leave us. I cannot conduct a royal audit with the clatter of your armor distracting me. I will summon you when I am ready to inspect the lower prisoner logs." Halloway hesitated, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. For a terrifying moment, Thomas thought the man might refuse, but the heavy red seal on the table and Elias's silent, predatory stance did their work. With a sharp grunt, the sergeant turned and marched back up the stairs, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind him. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We have 20 minutes. Elias. Maybe less." He sprinted to the central desk where the master ledger of shipments lay open. This was the book the master scribe had mentioned in his secret note. Thomas pulled the brass cylinder from his satchel and extracted the thin, translucent sheet of etched horn, the hollow oak grid. He laid the grid over the page titled Supplies for the Lower Bastion. It looked like a mundane list of bread, water, and straw, but through the holes in the horn template, only specific letters remained visible. Thomas read them aloud, his voice a frantic whisper. Cell 4. Behind the iron drain. The key is in the crucifix. Cell 4. Elias repeated, checking the corridor. That's in the black vaults. They're 2 levels deeper. Those aren't for grain, Thomas. Those are for people the governor wants the world to forget. Thomas gathered his tools. Then that is where we find my teacher. And the prince. As they moved toward the back of the archives, Thomas noticed a small jar on a side table. He opened it and sniffed. It was lampblack mixed with lavender oil, the exact scent he had used for his forgery. He felt a shiver of dread. The governor's scribes were using the same royal ink. If the governor had a spy in the Duke's court, they might already know the audit was a lie. Quickly, Thomas urged. The shadows are getting longer. The descent into the black vaults felt like entering a different world. The walls here were not just damp, they were weeping, with black water trickling down the stones into narrow, iron-grated drains. There were no torches here, only the faint, sickly glow of phosphorescent moss. Elias led the way, his boots making no sound on the wet floor. He held a small, shielded lantern that threw a narrow beam of light ahead of them. They passed cell 1, 2, and 3. Each was a heavy door of reinforced oak with a small, barred viewing slit. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thump of the citadel's heavy machinery. They reached cell 4. Thomas stepped to the door and looked through the bars. Inside, sitting on a pile of moldy straw, was a man whose hair had turned snow-white. He was thin, his hands trembling as he traced invisible letters on the floor. Master Valerus. Thomas whispered. The man froze. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the lantern light. Thomas. Is that you, my boy? Or has the dark finally taken my mind? It's me, Master. Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. We are here to get you out. Where is the boy? Where is the prince? Valerus crawled toward the bars, his voice a dry rasp. They took him an hour ago. Thomas. The governor. He knows the Duke is near. They are moving the prince to the harbor. A ship from the east is waiting. If he leaves the coast, he will never be seen again. We need the key. Elias said, checking the lock. It's a double bolt. I can't pick it without an hour and a workbench. Thomas remembered the message from the grid. The key is in the crucifix. He looked around the dark hallway. Mounted on the wall opposite the cell was a small, stone-carved crucifix, a relic of the old chapel that had once stood on this site. Thomas ran to it. It wasn't a decoration. It was a mechanism. He pressed the head of the figure, and with a soft clunk, the bottom of the stone cross slid open. Inside lay a heavy iron key with a distinctive, 3-pronged head. The master scribe's final lesson. Thomas muttered, grabbing the key and sprinting back to the door. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying snack. The door swung open. Valerus tried to stand, but his legs failed him. Elias caught him, slinging the old man's arm over his shoulder. Go! Valerus gasped. Don't worry about me. The harbor. Gate 6. The ship is called the Silver Ibis. You must stop them. Thomas. The boy is the only hope for the bloodline. But as they prepared to move, the sound of the iron door at the top of the stairs slammed open. Auditor. Halloway's voice boomed, no longer respectful, but full of lethal intent. The governor has just received word from the camp. The Duke's auditor is a 60-year-old man with a limp. You are nothing but a dead man walking. The black vaults erupted into chaos. The heavy boots of the governor's guards thundered on the stone stairs above, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of doom. Holloway was not alone. The clatter of at least half a dozen men followed his roar. Go! Master Valerus urged again, his voice cracking. I am a weight you cannot carry. We don't leave our own. Elias growled. He didn't hesitate. He looked at the narrow, iron-grated drain in the center of the floor, the one mentioned in the cipher. Thomas, the drain. The message said, behind the iron drain. It wasn't just a location for the key. It's an exit. Thomas dropped to his knees, his fingers clawing at the wet, slippery iron. The grate was heavy and rusted, but as Elias added his strength, the metal groaned and shifted. Below was not a shallow saw, but a steep, stone-lined chute designed to carry waste and rainwater directly out to the sea cliffs. It's a long drop, Thomas whispered, looking into the black maw. Better a drop than a noose. Elias replied. He shoved Valerus into Thomas's arms. Down. I'll hold the door for 10 seconds. Thomas gripped his teacher tightly. They slid into the darkness just as Holloway's torchlight flooded the corridor. The world turned into a blur of cold slime and rushing air. Thomas felt the rough stone scraping his back, the smell of salt spray growing stronger with every second. Suddenly, the chute ended. They flew into the night air and hit the freezing waters of the Oakhaven Bay with a bone-chilling splash. Thomas fought to the surface, gasping for air, his hands still locked on Valerus's tunic. A moment later, Elias surfaced beside them, his face a mask of grim determination. The harbor. Elias panted, pointing toward the cluster of swaying lights a half-mile to the south. We have to swim. If we don't reach Gate 6 before that ship sails, the prince is gone. The water was black and heavy, pulled by a fierce tide. Every stroke was a battle against exhaustion. Thomas's muscles screamed, and his wet cloak felt like lead. But the image of the boy, the final piece, kept his arms moving. They were no longer just searching for a golden box. They were racing to save the future of the realm. They dragged themselves onto the barnacle-covered pilings of the lower docks, shivering and exhausted. The harbor of Oakhaven was a forest of masts and rigging, the air thick with the smell of tar and rotting fish. To their left, the citadel stood on its high cliff, torches flickering along the battlements like angry eyes. Valerus, stay here, behind these crates. Thomas commanded, wrapping his wet cloak around the old man. Elias and I will find the ship. Gate 6. Valerus whispered, his teeth chattering. Look for the ship with the lateen sails. It belongs to the Sultan's vizier. They moved like ghosts through the shadows of the quay. The harbor was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night. Sailors were hauling crates of spices that smelled suspiciously of iron and oil, and armed men in foreign silks patrolled the gangplanks. They reached Gate 6. Standing there was the Silver Ibis. It was a beautiful, lethal-looking vessel, its hull painted a shimmering gray to blend with the fog. On its deck, Thomas saw a man in a rich, fur-lined robe talking to a figure in a red and gold citadel tunic. That's Governor Vane. Elias hissed, his hand moving to the small dagger he had hidden in his boot. And that man with him, that's the Eastern envoy. They're making the handoff. A small group of guards emerged from the ship's hold. In their center was a boy, no more than 10 years old, dressed in a simple white tunic. He looked terrified, his eyes wide as he was led toward a small longboat. The prince. Thomas whispered. We can't take them all. Elias said, counting the guards. There are 12 on the dock and more on the ship. We need a distraction. Something loud. Thomas looked at his satchel. It was soaked, but his scribe's kit was sealed in oilskin. He had charcoal, he had high-concentrate spirits for cleaning nibs, and he had a small bottle of quick-drying varnish. "Elias, I can't fight them with steel," Thomas said, his eyes darting to a stack of dry hemp rope and oil barrels nearby. "But I can make the harbor look like it's on fire. When the guards run to save the ship, you get the boy." "And what will you do?" Elias asked. Thomas pulled out a flint and his bottle of spirits. "I'm going to write a very bright ending to this story." As Thomas crept toward the oil barrels, the envoy reached out to take the prince's arm. The transfer was happening. Thomas struck the flint. A spark jumped, the spirits ignited, and the night was suddenly torn apart by a wall of orange flame. The fire didn't just burn, it roared. The mixture of Thomas's cleaning spirits and the harbor's oil barrels created a pillar of white-hot flame that licked the night sky. The suddenness of the blast sent a shockwave across the docks. Sailors screamed in 3 different languages, and the horses tethered to the nearby grain carts began to panic, their hooves striking sparks against the cobblestones. "Fire! The oil is blown!" A guard shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Governor Vane, usually a man of cold, calculated precision, stumbled back as a cloud of black smoke rolled over the quay. The Eastern envoy shielded his eyes, his rich robes catching a stray spark. For a few precious seconds, the meticulously planned handoff of the royal prince dissolved into absolute chaos. "Now!" Thomas yelled, though his voice was swallowed by the crackle of the flames. Elias didn't need the command. He moved like a wolf through the smoke, his limp forgotten in the adrenaline of the moment. He bypassed the guards who were running toward the fire with empty buckets and swung himself onto the low-hanging rigging of the Silver Ibis. With a flash of his dagger, he cut through the line holding the longboat, sending it splashing into the water. Thomas, meanwhile, found himself face to face with a citadel guard who had stayed back to watch the prince. The guard was a giant of a man, his face scarred and his eyes full of malice. He drew a heavy mace, the iron head whistling through the air. "You're the little bird from the tower." The guard sneered, stepping through the smoke. "I'm going to enjoy clipping your wings." Thomas backed away, his heart hammering. He had no sword, no shield, and no strength to match this man. But he had his satchel. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, glass-stoppered bottle of iron Gorlink concentrate. It was thick, acidic, and highly permanent. As the guard swung the mace, Thomas dived into the shadows of a stack of crates. He didn't run. He waited. As the guard turned, Thomas threw the bottle, not at the man's face, but at his feet. The glass shattered, slicking the smooth, wet cobblestones with the oily, black liquid. The guard stepped forward to strike, his heavy boots finding no grip on the ink-slicked stone. His feet flew out from under him, and he hit the ground with a clatter of armor. Before the man could regain his footing, Thomas grabbed a heavy wooden mallet used for caulking ships and swung it with both hands. It connected with the guard's helmet, and the man went still. "Elias, the boy," Thomas gasped, leaning against the crates for support. Across the dock, Elias had reached the prince. He scooped the boy up under one arm, his other hand wielding his sword to parry the clumsy thrust of a panicked sailor. They were at the edge of the pier, the fire raging behind them and the dark, cold water below. "Stop them. In the name of the governor, kill them both." Vane's voice pierced through the roar of the fire. The smoke was clearing slightly, and the governor had regained his composure. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias and the prince. But the governor was no longer the greatest threat. The Eastern envoy, the man in the fur-lined robes, stepped forward. He moved with a grace that suggested he was far more than a diplomat. He reached into the folds of his silk sash and pulled out a shamshir, a curved blade of Damascus steel that seemed to ripple like water in the firelight. "You have cost my master a great deal of silver, scribe." the envoy said, his voice cold and melodic. He didn't attack Elias. He turned toward Thomas. He knew that the scout was the muscle, but the scribe was the mind. If he killed Thomas, the heart of the resistance would stop beating. Thomas scrambled back, his hands finding nothing but wet wood and fish scales. The envoy moved with terrifying speed, the curved blade whistling toward Thomas's throat. Elias had leaped from the pier, placing himself between the envoy and Thomas. The two blades met in a shower of sparks. Elias was strong, but the envoy was fast, and Elias was still carrying the prince. "Take the boy." Elias grunted, shoving the prince toward Thomas. "Get to the longboat. Valerus is waiting by the pilings." Thomas grabbed the prince's hand. The boy was shaking, his face pale with terror. "Come with me, Your Highness," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We are the Duke's men. We're taking you home." They ran for the edge of the dock, jumping into the longboat that Elias had cut loose. Thomas grabbed the oars, his hands blistered and raw from the night's work. He began to row with a desperate, frantic strength. Behind them, Elias and the envoy were locked in a deadly dance. The envoy's blade was a blur, cutting through Elias's leather armor, but the scout refused to give ground. He was a wall of iron against the eastern silk. "Elias, jump!" Thomas shouted as the longboat drifted away from the pier. Elias saw his opening. He delivered a heavy kick to the envoy's chest, creating just enough space to turn and dive into the black water. He surfaced seconds later, his hand grabbing the back of the longboat. Thomas pulled him in, and they disappeared into the thick, black fog of the harbor. Governor Vane stood on the pier, the fire reflecting in his eyes as he watched his prize vanish. He had lost the prince, he had lost the gold, and now, he knew the Duke would be at his gates by morning. But as Thomas looked at the silent, shivering boy in the boat, he knew the war was far from over. The prince held a small locket around his neck, and inside was the final, most dangerous secret of all, the map to the king's treasury. The longboat glided through the black water like a splinter of shadow. Behind them, the orange glow of the harbor fire was being swallowed by a thick, freezing fog that rolled in from the sea. Thomas pulled at the oars, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. Every muscle in his back felt as though it were being pulled apart, but the sight of the boy, the royal prince, huddled in the bow kept him moving. They found Master Valerus exactly where they had left him, shivering amongst the barnacle-crusted pilings of the lower quay. Elias reached out a wet, scarred hand and hauled the old monk into the boat. "You have him," Valerus whispered, his eyes filling with tears as he looked at the prince. "Heaven be praised, you have the boy." "We aren't safe yet," Elias grunted, taking the oars from Thomas. The scout's face was pale from blood loss, but his grip remained steady. "Vane will have every rider in the city out on the North Road by dawn. We can't go back the way we came. We have to take the salt marshes." The salt marshes were a treacherous expanse of waist-high reeds and shifting mudflats that bordered the eastern side of Oakhaven. It was a place where the tide could swallow a man in minutes, and the mists were so thick that even the birds lost their way. It was the only place the governor's cavalry couldn't follow. For hours, they moved in a world of grey silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic dip of the oars and the distant, mournful tolling of the city's alarm bells. The prince, whose name was Julian, finally looked up at Thomas. "Why did you come for me?" the boy asked. His voice was small, but it carried the refined cadence of the court. "The governor said my father was dead and that the Duke had forgotten me." "The Duke never forgets his blood, Your Highness," Thomas replied softly. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a dry piece of parchment, the only one left. "And I am just a scribe. My job is to make sure the truth isn't erased by men like Vane." Julian reached into his tunic and pulled out a heavy silver locket. It was shaped like a heart, but it had no hinge. It was a solid piece of metal, engraved with a series of tiny, interlocking geometric patterns. He wanted this. He spent days trying to open it. He said it was the key to the king's treasury. Thomas looked at the locket. To a soldier, it was jewelry. To a thief, it was loot. But to a scribe, it was a palimpsest, a hidden message waiting to be revealed. He saw that the patterns weren't decorative. They were letters from an ancient, forgotten script used by the royal architects. "Elias, stop the boat," Thomas said suddenly. "I need to see this under the lantern." "We don't have time for jewelry, Thomas." Elias snapped, though he slowed his stroke. "It's not jewelry," Thomas insisted. "It's a map, but not to a room full of gold. If I'm right, the treasury is the one thing Vane needs to make his coup legal." They found a small, dry hummock of land deep within the marshes, hidden by a canopy of weeping willows. Elias kept watch, his sword resting across his knees, while Thomas knelt by the shielded lantern. He pulled a small magnifying lens from his kit, a precious tool of the scriptorium, and hovered it over the silver locket. The geometric patterns leaped into focus. They weren't just lines. They were a topographical grid. "Look here, Julian," Thomas whispered. "The lines match the flow of the 3 rivers. And these dots, they aren't stars. They are the locations of the royal seals. My father told me the treasury was where the spirit meets the stone," the boy said, leaning in. Thomas felt a jolt of realization. The king's treasury isn't a vault of coins. In the old texts, the treasury referred to the great registry of lineage, the original documents that prove who is the rightful heir to the throne. Without those papers, the duke is just a cousin, and Vane could claim the boy is an impostor. So the final piece isn't just the prince, Elias added, looking back from the reeds. It's his proof of birth. Thomas traced the map with a trembling finger. The location wasn't in a castle or a cellar. It was hidden in the foundation of the old Abbey of St. Jude, the very place where Thomas's journey had begun. The golden relic he had found weeks ago wasn't just a holy object. It was the compass that pointed to the stone beneath the altar. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic sound drifted through the fog. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the tide. It was the sound of a flat-bottomed barge cutting through the water. Vane hadn't sent his cavalry. He had sent his marines. "Douse the light," Elias hissed. The world plunged into darkness. A few hundred yards away, a blue light flickered through the mist, a witch light, used by the eastern spies to see through fog. They were being hunted by something more than just soldiers. "They have a tracker," Valerus whispered, clutching his wooden cross. "They have the Eastern envoy," Thomas corrected. "He doesn't need to see us. He can smell the ink on my hands and the silver of that locket. We have to move, now." They abandoned the boat, slipping into the cold, knee-deep mud of the marsh. Thomas held the prince's hand tightly, feeling the boy's heart racing. They had to reach the duke's camp on the far side of the valley, but between them and safety lay the envoy, a dozen marines, and the shifting, treacherous belly of the salt marshes. "Thomas," the prince whispered as they waded through the reeds, "if we don't make it, tell the duke the secret is in the stone. We're all going to tell him together, Julian." Thomas replied, though he gripped his heavy metal ruler like a dagger. The scribe was done with hiding. He was ready to finish the story. The blue glow of the witchlight pulsed through the fog like the heartbeat of a ghost. Thomas could hear the rhythmic splash of the marine's oars, a sound that grew louder with every passing second. The salt marshes were a labyrinth, but the Eastern envoy was a minotaur who knew every turn. He wasn't tracking their footprints. He was tracking the essence of the royal blood and the metallic scent of the silver locket. "We can't outrun them in the mud," Elias whispered, his voice strained. He leaned against a gnarled willow, his hand pressed against a fresh wound in his side. "They'll catch us before we hit the solid ground of the valley." Thomas looked at the prince, who was shivering so violently his teeth clicked. Then he looked at his satchel. It was nearly empty, but he still had his most dangerous tool, the bottle of phosphorus varnish. In the scriptorium, it was used to make certain letters glow in the dark of a chapel. Here, in the methane-rich air of the bog, it was a fuse. "Elias, take the prince and Valerus toward the old stone bridge," Thomas commanded, his eyes burning with a sudden, desperate clarity. "There is a patch of dragon's breath, the bubbling gas pools, just 50 yards to the east. I'm going to give the envoy a light to follow." "Thomas, no." Master Valerus started, but Elias grabbed his arm. "The scribe knows his chemistry," Elias said, a grim look of respect on his face. "Go, Thomas. We'll wait for you at the bridge. If you aren't there in 10 minutes, we don't stop." Thomas didn't wait. He moved toward the gas pools, his boots sinking into the stinking, black mire. He could see the blue light of the marine's barge reflecting off the mist. He reached the center of the gas patch, where the water bubbled with trapped air from the rotting vegetation below. He opened the phosphorus varnish and began to write on the surface of the water. He drew a long, glowing line that pointed away from the bridge and toward the deepest, most treacherous part of the marsh. Then, he took a small piece of flint and his metal ruler. The barge rounded a cluster of reeds. The envoy stood in the bow, his curved blade drawn, his eyes fixed on the glowing phosphorus trail. "There!" the envoy shouted in his melodic, foreign tongue. "The scribe has left his mark. Follow the light." As the heavy barge steered into the gas-choked channel, Thomas struck his flint. A single spark fell into the phosphorus. In an instant, the air ignited. A wall of blue and green flame erupted from the water, fueled by the methane pools. It wasn't a massive explosion, but it was a blinding, suffocating sheet of fire that turned the fog into a furnace. The Marines screamed as the barge's sail caught fire, and the envoy was thrown backward into the mud. Thomas didn't stay to watch. He ran through the smoke, his lungs burning, guided only by the distant, solid silhouette of the old stone bridge. He reached the arches just as Elias's hand reached out to pull him up. Behind them, the marsh was a hellscape of glowing mist and sinking screams. The tracker was gone. The first light of dawn touched the spires of the old abbey of St. Jude as the small group crested the final hill. Below them, the Duke's camp was a sea of white tents and fluttering banners. But Thomas didn't go to the tents. He led the prince and Elias straight to the abbey's great chapel, the place where his journey had begun with a missing box and a piece of blue silk. They entered the silent, cold sanctuary. The smell of old incense and stone dust felt like a homecoming. Thomas walked past the empty niche of the relic and knelt before the main altar. "The locket, Julian," Thomas said. The prince handed over the silver heart. Thomas didn't look for a keyhole. He looked at the floor. In the center of the altar's base was an engraving of the symbol that had haunted him for weeks. The circle with the vertical line. "It's not a symbol of a secret society," Thomas explained as he placed the locket into a circular indentation in the stone. "It's a gnomon, a shadow clock. The vertical line is the needle." As the morning sun hit the high stained-glass window, a single beam of light shot through the red robes of a painted saint and hit the silver locket. The light reflected off the geometric patterns and projected a map onto the floor. Thomas pressed the stone where the needle's shadow fell. With a grinding roar of ancient machinery, the altar slid aside. Beneath it lay a lead-lined chest. Thomas opened it to reveal a stack of thick, vellum scrolls, sealed with the golden wax signet of the first king. The great registry of lineage. Master Valerus whispered, falling to his knees. "The proof that Julian is the true heir, and the Duke is his rightful protector." "Thomas, behind you," Elias shouted. Thomas turned. Standing in the doorway of the chapel was Governor Vane. He was alone, his clothes torn and his face a mask of madness. He held a heavy crossbow, the bolt aimed directly at Thomas's heart. The scrolls. Vane rasped. Give them to me, and I will let the boy live as a commoner. Refuse, and the bloodline ends here. The story is already written, Vane. Thomas said, standing his ground. He held the registry high. You can kill the scribe, but you cannot burn the truth. The Duke is already at the gates. A thunderous blast of trumpets echoed from the courtyard. The doors of the chapel burst open, and the Duke himself entered, flanked by 50 royal knights in gleaming plate armor. Vane dropped the crossbow, his knees hitting the stone floor as he realized the game was over. The final word. Weeks later, the kingdom was at peace. Sir Richard and Governor Vane were in the tower, the eastern spies had fled, and Prince Julian was being prepared for his future coronation. Thomas sat at his familiar desk in the Abbey library. The golden relic of St. Jude had been returned to its place, but the secret vault beneath it was now empty, the registry safe in the royal archives. The abbot walked in, placing a heavy bag of gold coins and a new royal commission on the desk. The king's cousin wants you in the capital, Thomas. The abbot said with a smile. He says a man who can find a kingdom in a bottle of ink is too valuable to stay in a village. Thomas looked at the gold, then at his old, stained wooden pen. He thought of the fire in the marsh, the secret in the tower, and the cold water of the bay. He picked up his pen and began to write on a fresh sheet of parchment. I think I will stay here for a while, Father. Thomas replied, his voice calm and sure. The capital has enough historians. This abbey, however, still has a few secrets left to be catalogued. He dipped his pen into the ink. The circle was closed. The line was drawn. The story of the scribe of St. Jude was complete.